++3 days after the rescue of the Lady of the Three Seas, Infection ++. Night had fallen on the hive city of Talixorn, but the sounds of activity hadn't stopped. Even before the arrival of the warp storm, the noises of the city had never truly been silenced at any hour, for the hive was as much a giant factory as it was a city. Millions of souls had toiled day and night on assembly conveyors, fabricating the countless items necessary to both the life of the world's denizens and its exports to other systems. Now, with the planet isolated and traitor forces on the ground, these same chains had been reorganized to produce what the Loyalists would need in the war, but the sounds of work hadn't really changed. It had been easy to reconvert the production from civilian products to military supplies. After all, the opposite had been done mere years before, when the heresy had ended and Paraxis had been released from its duties to the war effort of the Imperium. Some discontent adepts murmured that it would save them time in the future to just assume the planet was always at war, instead of changing the production line's organization each time something like that happened. Their masters quietly encouraged that line of reasoning, for it implied that the Loyalists would succeed in defending their world from the traitors. If one had been able to look at Talixorn now and before Archon had unleashed the power contained on Ilias, one of the only differences they would see were the ruins standing where there had once been proud towers, brought low by the earthquakes that had followed the world being engulfed into half-reality. Although the excavation of the area was underway, the unstable nature of the ground and the incarnate nightmares still hiding within the rubble made it a dangerous task, and one that had to be performed while wearing heavy rebreather masks and under the protection of Astartes squads. Another difference would be sky. Before the coming of the storm, Talixorn had enjoyed the same night sky as any hive city in the Imperium, black pollution clouds, occluding the stars. For all the delicate ecological balance instaured by the Ultramarines when they had freed the planet, nothing could suppress the consequences of large-scale industrialization. Now though, the citizens of Talixorn didn't look up at all, for to do so would endanger not only their sanity, but also their very souls. In some streets, great panels of opaque plasteel had been fixed between buildings and lumi globes installed beneath them in order to block the skyline completely. But in the sections of the hive where this coverage wasn't finished, staring at the sky would expose the observer to the madness that reigned there. Even through the clouds, the unnatural light of the storm was still visible, and thousands had lost their minds staring at the chaotic display. The lights showed the ever-shifting tides of the Sea of Souls, and the only constant was the blighted orb that had once been the Palace of Glass, now lost to the servants of ruin. By now, only those who were already pledged to the dark gods dared to look at the sky, and even them tended to refrain from it, seeing as it would only bring the attention of Talixorn's transhuman protectors upon their heretical selves. As a result, the population of the hive kept its head down and tried very hard to ignore the manifestation of the power held by the Emperor's enemies that shone above them. Aside from the psychological consequences of such a way of life, it also made the job of the infiltrator hidden among them much easier. The infiltrator knew that there were others in the city who ultimately served the same masters as it. It didn't care, however, for its mission didn't call for it to rely on them, and, though the infiltrator didn't know it, neither did any other plan of the Awakened One. These cultists had no contact with the network created by the Lord of Shadows when he had prepared the arrival. They were a simple consequence of the storm radiating its taint down the world, and when the time came they would share the fate of all within Talixorn's walls. The spawn walked on the rooftops of the hive's towers, passing from one building to the next either by using the very same panels that were supposed to protect the city from the warp's corruption or jumping from one to the next after taking several minutes to contract its unnatural muscles like springs. It wasn't especially attempting to be stealthy, and would have been discovered easily had the hive's population been in a normal condition. But right now, it could as well have been invisible as it moved across the hive with a speed that no one on the ground could match. Among themselves, those of the Forsaken Sons who knew of the creature's existence called it a plague homunculus. Its existence had only been possible thanks to Farad the Reborn's newfound knowledge of Nurgle's secrets, and its birth could only have happened in a place as deep in the warp as the Gardener's lair on Paraxis Alpha's moon. Its unique properties made it perfectly suited for that kind of mission, and Farad had been eager to allow his creation to prove its value in the eyes of his divine patron. Those who had seen Archon speak with the fallen tech priest over the hololithic transmission had been unnerved by the enthusiasm displayed by the Gardener, so unlike it had been to the Sons of Mars' traditional calm. Allowing the creature to reach Talixorn had taken significant efforts, and Farad had impressed on the homunculus the importance of its mission. Now, with the blind devotion of an adoring child to its parent, the spawn of Nurgle aimed to fulfill it. Reaching its destination, the homunculus went on its belly and started to crawl, its movements unnaturally fluid as it did so. Unlike most of the buildings in the hive, this one was actually guarded, and though most surveillance cameras had long been disabled by the storm's static, one still functioning and placed on the rooftop would be enough to alert the guards of the homunculus' presence. While there were only humans in the building, which it could easily kill, if it came to that, its task here would be a failure. From the moment it reached the building until it left, stealth was of paramount importance. The homunculus found a vent and slipped within it, tearing free the grille that barred its entry with ease. The passage was too tight for its body, and so it unhinged its bones and reshaped the fluid beneath its tense skin. To a human observer, the sight would have been horrible. The humanoid shape turned into that of a snake, with empty patches of skin hanging around where its limbs had been and basic, dirty clothes surrounding the thing. After a few minutes of crawling down the vents, the bag of poison and bones reached the inside of the warehouse. Carefully removing the grill on the vent's other side, the homunculus dropped within what it had identified as one of Talek Sorn's food stores. Soon after the coming of the warp storm, Paraxis authorities had begun to seize all stocks of food on the planet, as well as hoard what few crops could still be made before the corruption of the warp made it dramatically unwise to consume what could grow on the world. Recycling could only carry the population so far, and the government had quite rightly believed that only through rationing would it have a chance to avoid mass starvation before the storm dissipated, if it ever did so. Food was distributed across the hive by dedicated workers under the protection of the militia, and so far riots related to the rationing had been avoided. Preachers in the street warned daily the masses of the risks of rebellion, especially when damnation was literally hanging over their heads. The air was very cold around the plague homunculus, as was to be expected of a place dedicated to storing food for long periods of time. Icicles hung from the ceiling and those who worked here needed to wear protective suits lest they die of hypothermia. Quickly, it replaced its bones into human shape. While this transformation was something of a waste of time seeing as it would have to break down its skeleton again in order to leave, it was better to be able to pass for human in case it met one of the guards. The probabilities were slim, but the mind of the spawn had been crafted from a shard of Farad's own, and for all the corruption of the former Magus there was still a streak of cold logic left in him and thus in his creations. After retaking a shape that a normal human could look at without immediately starting screaming, the homunculus started to move amongst the rows of stored foodstuff. It ignored the slabs of meat and the other more pricey elements. During the last several days, it had observed the distribution of food across the hive, identifying the basic components from which the nutritive gruel was made. It knew what to look for in order to achieve maximum propagation. Avoiding the few humans who walked in the building, looking for the inevitable would-be thieves that rationing, no matter how justified it was, would always cause to appear, it finally reached a huge container within which was stored one of the hive's stock of condensed protein paste. The homunculus climbed up the massive container, and punched through the lid, pushing its fist slowly through the metal. It looked down at the liquid, kept swirling by great paddles to avoid the formation of lumps. Then it spat into the tiny hole it had made, green, glowing poison dropping directly into the paste before being mixed with the rest of it. As the liquid left its body, the plague homunculus felt its vitality fade a little, like it had done the 4 previous times he had infected something with Farad's poison. It knew that fulfilling its mission would most certainly end it, but it didn't care. It had been brought into existence for that purpose, and it would show its gratitude to its maker by doing its duty without protest nor hesitation. It sought no reward for this, no blissful afterlife. The chance to prove its love for its parent was enough for the creature that had brought death into Talek Sorn. ++ 7 days after the rescue of the Lady of the Three Seas, Patient 0++. Pietro Lesnar didn't think of himself as a bad man. Yes, he was a thief. And yes, what he stole was technically property of the God Emperor himself, distributed amongst his subjects by those who were entrusted to do his will. But after what he had seen in the first days following the coming of the storm, before order had been restored, he just wasn't able to think of a few stolen rations as a sin deserving damnation. Back then, madmen had rampaged in the streets, demons had been brought forth from the warp by the murder of children, and countless horrors had been committed by those who, willingly or not, had lost their souls to the dark gods. Even if Pietro was ready to admit to being a criminal, he knew that he was no servant of ruin. He simply needed the money, and his old boss wasn't capable of paying him, what with him being dead and all. That had been a shame, really. The old shopkeeper had been a though and greedy bastard, but he hadn't deserved dying the way he had, torn to pieces by one of the psychos who had been cast across the entire planet from the prison world by one of the thrice accursed traitors, if rumor was to be believed. Left without a job and needing to pay rent, Pietro had reluctantly returned to his old set of skills, back before he had been able to find a stable position as the old man's aide. His only other skills consisted of moving heavy things around, and he didn't want to break his back helping in the manufactorum or in clearing the rubble of the ruined districts. Thus, thievery. And since few things had value now that the traitor's army was on the ground and liable to attack the hive any day, he had begun to steal food. Other products were on demand on the black market, but he didn't trust his skills to try his hand at acquiring any of them. Food was honest, in the sense that it couldn't be misused, unlike weapons. Another of the things many fearful citizens, and probably a few hidden cults, were stockpiling in preparation for whatever doom the traitors launched their way next. It was also untraceable, quickly vanished, and relatively simple to steal. For all the guards that accompanied the administratum's mobile kitchens, they were more here to prevent riots over the precious supplies and less to actually guard the stuff in the more traditional sense. With most eyes locked on the crowd, it was not very difficult to go in and out of the trucks, especially with the adept's robe Pietro had managed to acquire on the black market weeks ago. Standing on the street, waiting for his contact to arrive, Pietro looked around him, trying to prevent his nervosity to show. This was a fairly known place for illicit dealings, and just a few days ago the Arbits had made a raid here, arresting anyone they found with contraband on them. He had reached his current client through his usual channels, but that didn't mean he wasn't being set up. Those who ruled the hive liked to make examples of the food traffickers they caught. They didn't hang them in public or anything like that. The Sons of Calth considered such barbaric behavior not only ugly, but also dangerous for the soul of both the executioner and whoever watched and enjoyed the spectacle. Pietro didn't really understand it, but apparently strong emotions could allow demons to appear, and public executions were generally not calm affairs. But even if his life wasn't in danger, indentured servitude in the manufactorum for the next 2 decades was still something he wished to avoid. Still, as long as it was the Arbits who found him, he could at least try to run, and was fairly confident in his ability to escape. What really worried him was that other rumor that had been running around since the beginning of the week. Word of a strange, silent silhouette who passed from shadow to shadow, going to places that no one could guess in order to do things no one could know. It was probably nothing, at worst another thief who was less careful than Pietro. But, like almost everyone in the hive, he had heard about what had happened aboard the Lady of the Three Seas. Details were unclear, but it was common knowledge that one of the infamous Night Lords had managed to hid on the ship before butchering hundreds of civilians. The authorities had tried to keep the whole affair under wraps, but the traumatized survivors had quickly spread their tale, and now everyone looked above his shoulder in fear that another of the traitor Marines may have reached the hive without revealing himself. So far there had been no gruesome murders, but it could be that whatever that mysterious silhouette was, it was simply biding its time. At last, Pietro's contact arrived. In the darkened street, several ration packs changed hands, quickly followed by a bag of coins. Pietro didn't check the money. He would do it once he was back into his tiny flat, and if he had been shortchanged, well, there were a lot of other clients on the black market who would buy whatever he could take without being caught. It had happened before, but rarely. Pietro's appearance, a tall man with a scar running from his forehead to his lower jaw, given to him as a child by a thug's knife, was generally enough to keep the other party honest. As he walked down the streets, he took out the last pack he carried with him, the one he had got by waiting in line like everyone else. Despite everything, he still felt bad about personally eating anything he had stolen. It was stupid, but he considered the long period standing in the file something of a personal penance for his thief. Usually the gruel tasted of nothing identifiable, but it filled the belly and was supposed to give a grown man all the nutrients he needed to live and remain healthy. He thought that there was a strange aftertaste this time, but quickly dismissed it as a result of his imagination longing for some actual food. On his way back to his harp, Pietro started to cough, feeling a coppery taste in his mouth as he did so. He hoped he hadn't caught anything. ++22 days after the rescue of the Lady of the Three Seas, spreading. At long last, the war had come to Talaxorn. Not in the form of an army of traitor marines charging the city with chainswords held in their fists and hatred in their heart, nor as a tide of Neverborn bursting forth from the ether in a flow of madness and evil incarnate. Instead, it had come as a disease, a plague that spread amongst the population of the hive with alarming speed. Already thousands were lying down in the hive's hospitals, barely strong enough to breathe on their own. On a population of almost 2 billions, these were but a drop in an ocean, but the Astartes wardens of the city had learned the hard way not to underestimate the potential of diseases as a fell weapon of war. Physicians and nurses were doing all they could to keep the infected alive in an increasingly desperate battle, while others sought to understand where the plague had come from and how to fight it. To the knowledge of those who studied and fought the disease, no one had directly died of the plague yet, but work had significantly slowed in the factories as schedules were disrupted, and panic was slowly rising. Not only were the symptoms quite scary in their own right, coughing blood, quickly followed by the formation of boils on the infected skin and then by deadly pallor and weakness as the body fought against the disease, but their progression was alarmingly quick, with healthy patients turning into half-dead wretches in less than a week. The fact that no cure seemed to have any effect made it all worse. When the first cases had manifested themselves, the authorities had not thought much of it. Disease was a permanent feature of any high concentration of humanity, and the maritime hive city most definitively qualified as such. It was only once the adepts of the Officio Medicae had failed to both identify and heal the plague and that more and more victims had appeared that concerns had begun to rise. Then the psychers in the hive, astropaths who had somehow survived the storm so far and the librarians of the Sons of Calth who regularly patrolled the hive to look for signs of demonic incursion, had reported detecting the growing taint of the warp within the city. It had not been difficult to see the link between these two events for the veteran Space Marines. "This is an attack," declared Captain Erasmus of Sons of Calth's 4th Company to the assembled officials. "Somehow the Forsaken Sons are responsible for this epidemic. There is no doubt about it. Now, what do we know?" The captain was addressing a gathering of about 20 humans and posthumans inside what had once been the Arbit's headquarters in the hive and had become the center of the city's governance. Erasmus had been entrusted with command and defense of Talaxorn by Chapter Master Chiron. He and the 100 battle brothers of his company were both the leaders of the hive's military forces and the last line of defense if, when, the hive came under attack, just like his colleague in the hive city of the north. The center of the loyalist resistance was located in the hive city deeper inside the continent, between Talaxorn and the northern hive of Nlemos. There, in the gigantic spires of Asthena, second greatest city of Paraxis Alpha, the chapter master and 8 companies of Sons of Calth prepared for the next stage of the war. When the Forsaken Sons attacked one of the hives, be it Nlemos or Talaxorn, Menelaus Chiron would lead the counterattack at the head of the bulk of the chapter and tens of thousands of human soldiers. Or at least that was the plan. In practice, it seemed that the traitors wouldn't give them a straight battle, instead using despicable means of weakening the loyalists such as the warp-borne disease that was the reason for this meeting. "Our analysis has revealed traces of the virus in the food distributed to the population," said a robed adept of the Mechonicus through the Vox speaker that had replaced his mouth. "Not all of the sampled rations were contaminated, but enough that I ordered all of our reserves to be re-examined at once. My subordinates have already begun their work with the most vital stocks, as they are both most likely to have been targeted and the ones we need to keep the population fed. We have also detected the presence of the virus in several of the water distribution systems, and proceeded to their immediate purge. On this front also, the cleansing continues, but given the sheer size of the hive city and the tech priest actually hesitated there, something that worried all others present. It took much to unnerve the representative of the Mechonicus. The last time that had happened had been when news had reached him that some of his brethren had turned traitors in Suntorius. Diminished personnel available. It will take weeks before we have examined every single one of the 3,792 separate reservoirs and recycling devices which supply the hive with drinkable water. And all of it will mean nothing if whoever the traitors have got infiltrated poisoned them again," muttered the representative of the various militias that had been merged with the Arbits. "These were already guarded, but my men didn't see anything. Our investigation has also yielded little. We found the traces of the intruder's entrance. From the ways he has used, it is unlikely that we are dealing with a traitor Marine, unless he can somehow crawl through air vents. Our main lead so far is that one of these wretched cults is behind it. Many of my brothers have reported being told about a mysterious wanderer in our city's streets by those coming to them for spiritual counsel, said Father Colin. The man's voice was soft, still sore from the exertion he had endured when confronting the demon on the Lady of the Three Seas. Upon arriving to Talexorn, he had quickly become the unofficial head of the local ecclesiarchy, the tale of his acts spreading amongst the population. The old man hadn't sought such a position, but he had accepted it, and was doing his best to direct the efforts of the several hundreds of priests in the hive. Not only have many of them seen it in the darkness, but even those who haven't dreamed of it, seeing it spilling poison and death across the city. Once, it would have been unthinkable for Erasmus to act upon the dreams of humans. But that had been before the heresy, when the galaxy still made sense and the imperial truth still held firm in the universe. Now, he knew better than to reject such visions outright. Besides, his own librarians had reported suffering similar dreams. Not for the first time, he was hit by the similarity between the hive cities of the Imperium and a single living organism. The hive knew that it was under attack, the same way a man would know that he was sick. And, like a single man's immune system, it had ensured that those within its body that could deal with the infecting element were warned and sent into action. Argus, he called to another of the sons of Calv present. You and your squad have experience in fighting the spawn of the warp used by our enemy. While the rest of us continue purging the infected stocks of food and water, you will track this creature. Try to capture it if possible, alive if you can, or bring its remains. I will trust your judgment on that matter, but our apothecaries could learn much from it about this disease. My lord, asked the representative of the Officio Medicae, surely me and my colleagues are more qualified for. No, adept. They aren't. Though your knowledge of human physiology may surpass that of my apothecaries, it will mean nothing if they are themselves infected, and whatever is responsible for this contagion is bound to be far more dangerous than what you are equipped to deal with. So far, only us Astartes seem to be immune to this plague. We will be the ones to study it directly, while you and yours do all you can to help those who have been infected. Argus. Do you accept that duty? We will hunt down that infiltrator, vowed Argus to all those present, and deliver upon him the Emperor's justice. ++ 30 days after the rescue of the Lady of the Three Seas, first deaths. The hunt had lasted 8 days. 8 days of wandering across the hive's most questionable districts, hiding their power armor under dirty rags. 8 days of interrogating terrified humans and following dubious leads. 8 days of listening to the reports from the hospitals, where the first victims of the plague had finally begun to slip away from the healers' fingers and into death's cold embrace before their bodies were burned to prevent further spread of the epidemic. 8 days of letting Lycaon spread his mind into the city's heart, looking out for the signs of the intruder in its midst. It hadn't been a complete waste of time. Argus' squad had discovered 4 cults of the ruinous powers hiding in the Underhive during their quest, and purged the fools with bolter and blade before calling for the Arbits to take care of the fallout. Their mere presence had also dismantled several networks of traffickers, who had chosen to abandon their ways rather than risk the wrath of the transhuman walking amongst them. But while the death of heretics and the suppression of crime were always worthwhile endeavors, it wasn't what they had sworn to accomplish. The source of the disease that was slowly spreading through the hive, the mysterious infiltrator, had eluded them. Lycaon's efforts had been obstructed by the fact that the essence of plague carried by the intruder was now thinner, and its psychic spore was emanating from those who were infected as well. They had crossed paths with teams of tech priests tasked with cleansing contaminated water sources several times while following the librarian's senses, to the growing frustration of all the squad. Now, though, they finally had succeeded. As yet another night of fruitless searching was about to come to an end, Lycaon had caught the psychic scent of the plague in the middle of one of the habitation districts, and it was both potent and moving. It wasn't one of the infected, nor was it one of the contaminated locations. As soon as the librarian had informed Argus, the sergeant had separated his squad in order to surround the infiltrator's estimated position. It was moving in the near-empty streets, at the same speed as a walking human. From a distance, it looked no different from any number of refugees who now lived in the city, though the cloak it wore over its shoulders was dirtier than what the exiled had been provided by the Loyalists' quartermasters. Showing discretion far beyond what one would think the armored transhuman capable of, the Astartes took position in ambush, waiting for their sergeant's signal. Once Argus had confirmation that all of his men were in position, he gestured to Lycaon to begin. With a pull of psychic energy, the librarian ripped the cloak off their target's shoulders, giving away its exact position to the rest of his squad, who jumped out of their hiding places. Immediately, the few humans in the street started screaming in horror as they saw what was revealed. The thing looked like a skeleton upon which human skin had been tensed and wearing a filthy and torn working uniform, exposing its chest, which looked as if there were no organs nor muscles in it. The sons of Calth had seen corpses looking healthier than this. Seams were exposed where patches of skin had been knitted together on its skull, and the marks of disease were spread over the corrupted tissue. The creature looked at the librarian, sensing the presence of the one who had revealed it, and Lycaon almost recoiled at what he saw. Beyond the skull-like appearance of the creature's head, its eyes were true visions of horror, two black orbs of rotting matter, with unholy light shining at their core as the fell essence of the creature looked upon the world through them. It screamed at the Astartes with a sound not unlike a dying rattle, if one was strong enough to shatter windows. The sons of Calth weren't fazed by the aspect of their quarry. They had seen worse during the heresy, and they charged the creature with bolters raised high, shouting at it to surrender or face the Emperor's wrath. They didn't need to bother with that. "That is no cultist," voxed Lycaon, giving voice to the thoughts of all of his squad mates. "It isn't even human. I can't explain it, but don't try to capture it alive. Shoot to kill, brothers." Before the Astartes could follow the librarian's advice, the infiltrator ran away from them, leaving the exposed street for the cover of one of the harp towers. The sons of Calth gave chase to the creature, but it was faster than its skeletal frame suggested, and kept ahead of the squad as it climbed up the stairs of the dozens of floors. The pursuit went on for several dozens of minutes, with shocked mortals throwing themselves away from the giants and their quarry. Argus felt sorely tempted to open fire on the thing, but held back. Inside this building, packed as it was with resting workers, there would still be collateral damage even if every shell hit the target, and the Space Marine knew all too well the damage even shrapnel from a bolt could to a human body. They finally reached the rooftop of the building, a handful of meters behind the humanoid they were chasing. Despite having nowhere to run, it kept going forward in the direction of the opposite edge. Without needing to be ordered to, Argus squad opened fire on the creature, their bolters barking in the air of dawn. Almost every bolt hit the target, dropping it flat on the floor, and those few that missed harmlessly detonated on the walls of another building on the street's other side. Carefully, bolters still aimed at their quarry's remnants, the Space Marines approached what, according to all logic, should have been a corpse but somehow wasn't. The creature was riddled with gaping holes which leaked a greenish liquid that hissed at the contact of the rockreet, yet still it crawled toward the rooftop's edge. What was it hoping to achieve? There was no escape from the sons of Calth's squad. Over the edge, there was only a fall of several hundred meters into. Argus' blood ran cold as sudden realization reached him. Had it been any other time, letting the creature suicide would have been of little consequence. But now, down there was a street packed with tens of thousands of workers going to rest or returning to their stations as the work shifts changed. If the creature fell down, it would burst amongst all of them, spreading the poison in its body and infecting hundreds of them in a single moment. They still didn't know for certain how the disease spread from human to human, but a quick conservative estimate warned Argus that tens, possibly hundreds of thousands would be contaminated in mere hours if the creature was allowed to jump. And after that, the propagation would be exponentially quicker. He ordered his men to cease fire, fearing that the impetus of their bolts would propel the cursed thing over the edge, and ran toward the infiltrator he had spent days hunting. Sensing his approach, the creature crawled faster, desperate to fulfill its suicidal mission. Argus moved with all the speed his transhuman physique and his power armor could grant him. His bolter dropped to the ground, hands held before him, reaching for a hold of the thing that wanted to murder the city he was sworn to protect. He almost didn't make it. His hands tightened around the creature's ankles even as it fell, and he hauled it back on the rooftop before slamming it against its floor with all his strength. There was a repulsive crack as the rotten bones of the plague construct broke in dozens of pieces, yet still the thing moved. He let go of the creature's limbs, and it twitched on the damaged rockreet, laying on its back and glaring at Argus with its single remaining eye. With a snarl, the sergeant brought his boot down onto its skull, reducing it to pulp with a crunching sound of bone being shattered between ceramite and rockreet. He sighed in relief, only to tense once more when he noticed that the creature was still moving. Its skeletal limbs were scratching the rooftop's floor, still trying to propel the torn and burst remnants over the edge and into the teeming masses of humanity below. Somehow, removing the thing's head hadn't destroyed whatever vile consciousness animated it. A part of his mind noted that there was no trace of grey matter in the mess he had made of the thing's head, only the same greenish liquid that had dripped from its wounds. The greater part of himself, however, was recoiling in disgust, and considering the best ways to dispose of the creature's remains once and for all. He knew that his orders had been to bring the creature, dead or alive, for examination, but this was no natural thing, which could be dissected, studied and understood. This was as much a spawn of the warp as it was the product of mad genetic engineering, similar to some of the creations of the Dark Mechanicum that the Sons of Calth had fought when they were still Ultramarines. The only thing one could learn from such things was the way to damnation. "Alec," he called to one of his warriors. "Give me your plasma pistol." His brother tossed him the weapon, and Argus caught it in midair before aiming it straight at the mass of broken bones and tainted fluids writhing on the ground. He let the weapon going through its cycle of charging for a few seconds, feeling the handle vibrate in his hand as energy was gathered in the pistol's arcane mechanisms. In the Imperium, plasma weapons were at once unreliable and far too useful to abandon entirely. Keeping the energy contained was something of a gamble each time the weapon was used, for much of the knowledge that allowed them to be built had been lost during the Age of Strife, and any hope of recovering it had been crushed when Mars had burned in the fires of rebellion. Still, despite the risks of the gun exploding in his hand, Argus didn't hesitate. His squad didn't have any other weapons capable of destroying the infiltrator as completely. This was an urban mission, after all. No fusion grenades or flamethrowers had been allowed to the squad, let they reduce the hive they were supposed to protect to ash and rubble. Once the pistol was charged, he pulled the trigger without another word and let purifying plasma burst from the weapon's muzzle and turn everything around the twitching living corpse into molten rock. There was the sound of liquefying rockreet and sizzling biomatter, and even though the creature had no mouth left at this point, Argus still heard it screaming as its form was consumed into oblivion by the heat of a newborn star. Somehow, he wasn't certain if what he heard was a scream of agony or scornful laughter. ++ 48 days after the rescue of the Lady of the Three Seas, quarantine ++. Failure, Argus had found out, tasted like the smell of burnt corpses. Standing atop a barricade at one of the hive's quarantine districts, the sergeant of the Sons of Calth breathed in the smoke of the funeral pyres, punishing himself for his failure by enduring the acrid smell. For all that he and his squad had destroyed the source of the infection 4 weeks ago, they had been too late. The plague had continued to spread, unstopped by the efforts of both the Officio Medicae and the tech priests who had cleansed the sources of infection. There were simply too many humans infected, the hospitals were full of the dying and the dead, and those who were contaminated but not yet showing the symptoms spread the disease even further before even knowing they were sick. Already, tens of thousands had died, and more fell by the hour. In secret so as to avoid panic, the Sons of Calth had begun to evacuate the more valuable personnel out of the hive, bioscreening each of them to ensure that the infection wasn't carried to other hives. But though the discreet exodus had remained under wraps so far, other signs were less easy to conceal from the public eye. Entire sections of Talek Sorn, including the area where the refugees from Meridies had been relocated, had been locked down, those trapped within abandoned to their fate, and traffic with the rest of the continent was simply forbidden. While the majority of the population should still be clean of the virus, there was no way to screen the entirety of the billion humans with any reliability. The mere fact of making them stand in line would expose those who weren't infected to those who were. Unlike what had happened to Meridies, Talek Sorn was dying from a death that would take the entirety of its people with it. The Sons of Calth could save the Imperium's citizens from traitor Marines' guns, they were ill-equipped to defend them from this plague. The Astartes knew it. Worse, so did the people, and they were starting to panic. In the last week alone, 4 aircrafts had been shot down by the Sons of Calth's own guns. Those who had sought to flee the city with their private transports had died under their protectors' fire, in order to prevent them from causing further harm to the Loyalist war effort. Talek Sorn's industry had stopped, in a last-ditch attempt to prevent great numbers of people to be gathered together, but with food still only supplied through the distribution trucks, that was a forlorn hope. It would slow the progression of the disease, but not by much. Though the priests in the streets still spoke of the plague as a test, a scourge sent by the dark gods that could only be endured through faith in the God Emperor's will, Argus knew that the city was already considered lost by the High Command. Though it hurt to think that they were effectively abandoning 1 billion people to their death, the sergeant understood the logic of that decision. He had seen the projections of the apothecaries, given the current speed of the infection. They only had weeks remaining before the entire population was infected. Riots would break out long before that, and that was if the Chaos cults didn't make their move. Argus' lips curled into a sneer as he thought of the degenerates. With the loosening of the Loyalists' hold on Talixorn and the propagation of the plague, those who embraced the blasphemous teachings of the Dark Gods had grown both stronger and bolder. Pamphlets had been found denouncing the Emperor as a dead tyrant, and those who ruled in his name as impostors keeping humanity from its true destiny as the favored species of the Pantheon. That much was nothing new. Argus had heard the same delusions 100 times and more. What had the authorities worried was the claims of the cults that they held the key to surviving the plague. They didn't know if it was true, or just a lie to drag naive and desperate souls into the heretics' clutches, but it didn't matter in the end. Despair could do strange things to a mind, and the son of Calth had no doubt that many of the cult's new recruits would never have thought of betraying the Emperor if not for the disease ravaging their bodies. The librarians were feeling the veil between reality and the unrestrained energies of the warp thinning. Each night, the storm above Talixorn seemed to grow more agitated as it fed upon the dying agonies of the hive's inhabitants. The nightmares of the sleepers no longer featured the infiltrator, but instead the rotting shape of the hive and all who lived within. The fragmented images of demons belonging to the plague god's choir, and a towering figure with 3 green, glowing eyes, looking down at the city's suffering. The hive was dying, and it dreamt of its own death. Its defenders had tried to stop the infection and failed. Now, the cancer was spreading, turning more and more healthy cells into carriers of death. Without needing to fire a single bolter, the Forsaken Sons had already taken Talixorn from the Loyalists. Argus breathed in the smoke again, feeling his 3 lungs contract as they attempted to filter the unwholesome particles it contained. He had been warned by the apothecaries that not only was this an entirely too morbid habit, it would also allow the remnants of the disease, carried by the smoke, to reach his lungs. It wouldn't be enough to infect him, of course. Astartes' physiology could be exposed to far more trying conditions, but whether his metabolism would suppress the disease entirely or he would live with burning, aching lungs until the end of his life as his body fought against the plague, they had no idea. Argus didn't care. This was the less he could endure as punishment. Plus 53 days after the rescue of the Lady of the Three Seas, plague-born. When the true scope of the Forsaken Sons plot revealed itself, Talixorn was already more than half dead. Millions had perished from the plague, and their bodies were too numerous to be disposed of safely. Giant piles of corpses were massed into emptied buildings by trucks whose dedicated crew wore isolated suits initially designed for void work or left to rot in the streets. Food was scarce since the distribution of rations had all but stopped, and the cults of plague openly ruled in entire districts. The Sons of Calth still launched purges on the most obvious such gatherings, but it was mostly in vain. For every cultist they killed, another dozen would appear amongst the desperate population they had failed to protect. The last section of the hive still holding a semblance of order was in what had been the Loyalists' headquarters in the hive. High barricades sealed off the zone completely, protecting a few thousands remaining uninfected citizens and soldiers. Grim-faced Astartes kept guard over the walls, mercilessly gunning down those who tried to pass them in order to prevent them from spreading the plague. Evacuation of the last defenders was made impossible by a sudden shift in the planet's air currents that had birthed a storm of titanic proportions between Talixorn and the other hives. With no way out of the infected hive city, all they could do was wait out the tempest, and pray it was natural enough that it would eventually dissipate, while watching the throngs of mortals dying at their doors, praying for help until their dying breath. With depressing regularity, the Sons of Calth had to bring their flamers to bear and burn the piles of corpses at their walls to ash, lest they reach high enough that one may pass over the barricade. And then, the 3 librarians still present in the hive felt it. Not a ritual perpetrated by slaves to ruin finally reaching its conclusion, but a contraction of the warp, as if some invisible tipping point had been passed. A surge of chaotic energy ran across the hive, emanating from 100 sources at once. The psychically gifted Astartes cried out in pain as they felt the souls of 100 dying men and women being violently reshaped by the power of the warp, twisted into something that wasn't human yet wasn't wholly demonic either. Worst of all was the fact that these souls had welcomed this change, embracing the unholy power of the plague that had been slowly killing them. Even those without the sixth sense heard, as if coming from a great distance, the booming laughter of the Plague Father as Mor joined his children. Still trembling from the psychic shock, the librarians called for Captain Erasmus, warning him of a possible demonic incursion. Although the surge of power had passed, its touch lingered in the other parts of the hive, gathering around the piles of the dead and permeating the mounts of corpses. Across the hive, the survivors who dared to come out of their refuges in search of supplies, risking to be infected rather than die of hunger, froze at the scenes unfolding before them. Such had been the amount of death in the hive that none of them wasn't in sight of a corpse when the second effect of the warp pulse revealed itself. The corpses, rotting in the streets and bearing the marks of the plague's terminal state, started twitching. Slowly, with jerking motions, they rose to their feet, horrible moans leaving decomposed throats. Entire buildings collapsed as the dead within pushed around themselves, trying to get out of the piles under which they were buried. Even the corpses in the most advanced stages of decay rose, ignoring the basic physics that dictated that their limbs should fall off. Through a dozen Vox channels, the same desperate, horrified message echoed. The dead are walking. Immediately, 1,000 battles erupted inside the city as packs of survivors defended themselves against the tide of reanimated corpses. At the doors of the quarantine zone, the sons of Calth saw a horde charge their walls, led by those who had welcomed the disease within them and been remade for their devotion. These plague-born, as the librarians had called them, were directing the legions of the mindless dead toward the Astartes stronghold, singing the praises of the god of life and death as they did so. Heavy bolter fire shredded the horde to pieces, while snipers took down the plague-born with headshots, vaporizing their skulls with mass-reacting bolt shells, the only way to take them down, as other wounds seemed simply to close or to remain open without causing any pain or discomfort. No matter their numbers, the plague zombies were no match for the company of Erasmus, entrenched as they were behind high walls of prefabricated plasteel. After several hours of butchery, the tide of the dead turned back, leaving countless thousands in pieces across the various streets leading to the Sons of Calth's positions. Erasmus stood on one of the barricades, listening to the groans of the millions remaining zombies and the sporadic sounds of battle as the survivors fought for their lives. His hands were curled into fists, almost trembling with impotent rage and the bitterness of failure. Talaxorn was lost. There was no way his men could reclaim it from the undead host that now walked its streets. Though the creatures were weak and mindless, their sheer number would crush the Astartes one by one if they left their current position. Oh, each of them would take down 100, perhaps 1,000 of the zombies before falling, but there were millions of them, and only 100 Sons of Calth. There was only one possible course of action. As soon as the storms isolating Talaxorn had dissipated, he would call for extraction of his men and as many of the survivors as he could, and then do what he had to do to deny victory to the servants of the Dark Gods. ++ 77 days after the rescue of the Lady of the Three Seas, outbreak. 24 days since the days the dead had risen, and they were still trapped in this hell of a city. The storms hadn't yet abated, keeping aerial extraction, the only reasonable way anyone was leaving, impossible. It was clear now that the tempest was no natural perturbation, though whether the cursed Forsaken Sons had deliberately engineered it somehow or if it was the result of the greater storm above was still unknown. Standing guard over the barricade that separated the tenuous safe zone from the ravening hordes of the living dead, former Arbit's Prevost Nerosas, now just one more grunt in the army forces on the loyalist side of the war for Paraxis Alpha, held his las rifle tightly in his hands. He had been at his post for 3 hours, and he still had as much to wait until the next shift. Besides him, the 20 meters broad barricade was manned by several dozens other men and women armed with lasguns and other weapons, as well as 10 Sons of Calth. Unlike the frail mortals fighting alongside them, the Astartes had no need of being replaced so that they may rest. As far as Nero could say, they were sleeping while standing on guard, in between the waves of putrescent flesh hurling themselves at the barricade. Despite the tension and the horror of facing the raised dead, the barricades had held so far with relative ease. Concentrated fire from the human soldiers, spikes and handcrafted explosives placed on the undead-only path of attack thinned the horde before it reached the wall, while snipers took down the plague-born that led the mass of zombies to battle. On more than one occasion, Nero and his comrades had repelled the horde before it even reached the barricade itself. When they didn't, they would retreat and let the Space Marines tear apart the creatures reaching the barricade's top, taking care of the isolated stragglers that managed to slip past the Sons of Calth's unyielding defense. After each attack was beaten back, the Sons of Calth would get down on the other side of the barricade to dispose of the torn and mangled bodies and reset the various traps and obstacles set in the horde's way. It was somehow disrespectful for the Astartes to do such menial work, but the risk of some of the corpses still being animated was too great to risk human soldiers. Besides, no one knew when the next horde would attack, and only the Space Marines had a chance of making it to the barricade before being submerged if they were on the outside when the Walking Dead attacked. In time, the horror of the situation had begun to dissipate. The human mind's capacity to adapt to anything once again proved its value, and the culling of the undead horde became just work to the mortal defenders. They woke from their rest, prepared, went to the barricades, shot the hordes, went to rest. Through habit and repetition, they were capable of dealing with the fact that millions had died, the city was lost, and they were trapped in its ruins with the undead spawn created by the disaster. In the first days, there had still been survivors beyond the Sons of Calth's stronghold, fighting for their lives and trying to reach the Astartes or leave the hive altogether. A few had even made it here, and after careful bioscreening by the apothecaries, had been allowed to join the few hundred human survivors. Now though, only the living dead and the traitors who had become their leaders remained in the corpse of Talek Sorn. Movement at the other end of the avenue caught his attention, and he lifted his binoculars to his eyes. He gasped, the sound taken up by others around him who saw the same thing as he. A new horde was gathering, but that wasn't the reason for his terrified surprise. He could see beings that had once been Space Marines at the center of the growing horde, and though the image was blurred, he distinguished clouds of flies surrounding them, and saw that their armor was rotten and corroded, leaking pus and other pathogens. 10 of these wretched parodies of Astartes surrounded a smaller silhouette, giving it space with an impression of reverence that made Nero's blood run cold. What manner of being could command respect from such monstrosities? The creature reminded Nero of the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but that was in the same way that the giants at its side reminded him of Space Marines. Rotted flesh and rusted augmetics were linked by cables crackling with eldritch energies and tubes dripping green, glowing liquid onto the ground. 7 mechadendrites of corroded metal and living, pulsing flesh emerged from its back, ending in an assortment of blades, injectors and other devices of which Nero had no wish to know the use. A cloak of vermin-infected leather hung from the heretic's shoulders, and Nero had no doubt at all that it had come from an unwholesome source. There were shouts of alarms and call for reinforcement at the barricade, but Nero kept his attention focused on the enemy. The horde advanced, and this time the traps and lesser barriers set in its path couldn't stop its advance. The corrupt Astartes opened fire on the defenders far before their minions reached them, forcing them to take cover under a volley of bolts that melted the flesh of those who were hit to sludge. Nero saw a son of Calth being shot in the chest fall down the other side of the barricade, his body rapidly decomposing. It fell and bursting apart when it hit the ground. So far, the hordes have not used any ranged weapons, but the possibility had still been taken into account when the barricade had been built. Nero and the other defenders fell flat on their bellies and placed their weapons muzzles through the small openings in the wall, firing blindly into the mass of flesh. Automated turrets opened fire as the Sons of Calth chose not to spare ammunition any longer, and volley after volley of heavy bolter shells impacted into the ranks of the Walking Dead. But more and more were coming, forming a shield in front of the Forsaken Sons and the corrupt tech priest. Magazine after magazine was emptied into the tide, and each defender of the barricade achieved kill ratio of at least 100 to 1, but such losses were insignificant to the oncoming horde. Once more the tide reached the barricade, and the bodies of the living dead began to pile at its base, forming a ramp of rotten flesh for their kindred to escalate. None of the human defenders retreated this time. They knew all too well that there would be no running away from this foe. A plague-born landed less than 2 meters away from Nero, and its gaze fixed on the soldier. Once, this had been a man, but now the thing before Nero was a monster. Its skin was falling off in patches, revealing muscles eaten through by parasites and worms. Its hands had fingers shortened a phalanx, with the bone turned into a claw. Its face bore a large scar, but its eyes were what caused Nero the most horror. They glared at him not with the blind gaze of the walking dead, but with inhuman malice and hunger, and a depthless joy at being alive that was somehow more disturbing. That the creature's stink of disease was overpowering, and nausea filled Nero, submerging him with the urge to puke and making his hands tremble, preventing him from shooting the creature. He tried to aim, but his weapon was snatched from his hands and broken in two pieces by the half-demon, who started to laugh as the rifle's fragments started to rot in its hands. The sound was unlike anything the soldier had ever heard, like the splash of a rock tossed into stagnant waters. Nero died a few seconds later, his throat torn apart by the scarred plague-born as he tried to force a prayer to the emperor through his frothing lips. Less than a minute later, the barricade fell, the tide of undead passing above it like a sea of discomposed bodies finally reaching the top of an embankment. Thousands of the walking dead hurled themselves into Talixorn's last sanctuary, pushed forward by the will of their heretical overseers. That scene was being repeated all around the defended zone, as the Sons of Calth gave the order to abandon the barricades and retreat to the position where the last survivors of the coastal city would make their last stand against the horde. 12 minutes after the instant of his demise, Nero's corpse started to twitch, and he rose to his feet, wailing and moaning, before beginning to walk along the tide of putrefying flesh. His soul was gone, devoured by the never-born spirits that haunted Talixorn the moment it had left its body, but his infected flesh was Nurgle's to command, and it would serve the purposes of the Chaos God. As it started its march, it was passed over by Farid the Reborn and his escort of plague marines, both equally eager to face the last Sons of Calth in the city. When the first reports arrived that the storms that plagued the continent had shown signs of diminishing, more than a month had passed since the horde of the dead had broken into the so-called safe zone. Of the 100 Sons of Calth who had held their ground against the zombies, only half that number remained, the rest lost slowly, one by one, to the endless pressure of the undead. Of the Astartes who had fallen, few had had their gene seed recovered, as the Sons of Calth couldn't afford to launch counterattacks into the zombies' ranks to reclaim their bodies. The human survivors had fared even worse, with less than 1 in 10 of the thousands of original survivors lost in the nightmare that had been the breach of the lines. After the rotting army of the Plague God had broken their defenses, led by the corrupt Marines and their strange, equally tainted tech priest, madness had descended onto the last untouched district of Talixorn. Captain Erasmus had done his best to marshal the defenders, leading as many of them as he could to one of the fallback positions he had prepared, but the rest of them had been quickly surrounded and torn to pieces by the horde, those who were lucky, at least. Those who hadn't been were now part of the undead legions surrounding the Loyalists' last fortress in Talixorn, where they would make their last stand against the forces of ruin. The retreat had been a messy affair, and they had lost many good soldiers as they climbed up to the refuge. The place where the few hundred survivors had barricaded themselves was a cathedral dedicated to the worship of the god Emperor. It was built amongst the highest spires of the city, with only one path leading into it and its back at the top of a cliff several kilometers high. It had surprised Erasmus to learn that there was such a building in the Hive City. Churches for the newly founded ecclesiarchy were only beginning to be approved of in the rest of the Imperium when the Sons of Calth had been trapped by the warp storm. But this had been a memorial before the heresy, not a temple, but a place of remembrance for all those who had suffered under the cruel rule of Paraxis masters before the Great Crusade had liberated them. Back then, the building had been filled with depictions of the war against the inhuman monsters, and it had taken little work for it to be turned into the greatest house of faith in the Hive City. A few altars and icons of him on earth, images of the 9 loyal primarchs and demonized visions of the traitors, and the cathedral had been ready to serve. Each day, thousands of people had walked the long march up the spire in order to pray. The closest automated transportation still left the pilgrims several kilometers away and 600 meters below the building. The importance of the cathedral had grown, and in time a giant statue of the emperor had been built in the center of the building, each block of stone dragged all the way up with nothing but mortal effort. Now, the armies of the dead were gathering at the base of the spire, but they couldn't bring it down without collapsing the entire city, and they lacked both the intelligence and the means to do it. With the elevators and other transports disabled, the horde had to climb the kilometers that separated the cathedral from the Hive's ground. Vast swathes of rubble and collapsed towers enabled even the clumsy zombies to do so, but for each one that reached the cathedral's level, 3 more fell on the way and turned into pulp or crushed. Another 2 of their kind massed below them. Even once they reached the cathedral, Erasmus had collapsed the only access, a bridge between spies leading straight to the entrance, and barred any opening, while placing his men on the cathedral's top. Even compared with those of the previous defensive setup, the kill ratios they were achieving were almost impossible to believe, but then again, every single zombie they put down was another loyal Imperial citizen who they had failed to save. From a tactical point of view, it made sense to take refuge here, both because of the defensible position and of the effect the place seemed to have on the undead. They wailed in pain when they drew nearer, only actually attacking when driven to it by one of the plague-born, and notably slower and weaker than before. Lycaon had told the captain that it was due to the belief of all the people that had lived in the hive, including those whose corpses were now opposing them, being channeled through the warp and drawn to this place as a symbol of the Imperial faith. Emotion was power in the Sea of Souls, and the storm wasn't only bringing the dark gods closer to Paraxis. All emotions were bleeding into real space, and there were even reports that angels had been sighted around the planet's cardinal, though Erasmus wasn't quite certain this last one wasn't rumors blown out of proportion by a combination of subtle propaganda and natural exaggeration. For lack of a better term, the cathedral was holy ground, and the creatures of chaos were harmed merely by approaching it. From a more emotional perspective, it was also very appropriate. They stood atop a pillar of rockcrete and human engineering, the last place of purity in a hive above a roiling sea of corruption. Apt. Very apt indeed. Here they would make their stand, under the Emperor's eyes, and prove themselves worthy of him. If what the librarian said was true, if they were actually fighting with his blessing, then they would make the traitors pay dearly for their victory. Hundreds of thousands of the dead had been butchered in the battles for the cathedral, their rotting flesh forming a giant wall in front of the building and piling up at the bottom of the spire, where the defenders tossed them. Now though, something Erasmus had both waited for and dreaded had come. The storms were dissipating, at least those which existed wholly on the right side of reality, and with that came the bitter hope that they would be rescued. The grim determination that had kept them going for 30 days risked being undermined by that most treacherous emotion. Erasmus knew the value of hope. Both mortals and Astartes fought harder if they were hoping for something more than simply killing as many enemies as they could before they fell. It could be hope for anything, hope that their deaths would serve a greater purpose, hope that reinforcements would arrive, hope that by killing just one more enemy they would tip the balance of the war. Hope could make cowards into heroes. But every single man and woman in the cathedral was already a hero, and hope, especially false hope, was a two-edged blade that could also turn heroes into cowards. He had seen both of these happen on Calth. Men fighting against impossible odds while they thought they still could survive the madness around them, and others having renounced the idea and fighting for vengeance as much as courage and honor, only to break down after receiving a single transmission promising reinforcements that ended with the death of the sender in a word-bearer's attack. Even Space Marines, who could endure pain and fear, could be broken by hope. It was impossible to keep a secret in the confined, overcrowded spaces of the cathedral, so everyone knew that the blasted storms were dissipating. They also all knew that in the last communications with Chapter Master Menelaus before the storms had reached the point where what little communication equipment they had saved couldn't reach him, the Supreme Commander of Paraxis Alpha's defense had promised to send evacuation teams as soon as it became possible. And the simple truth was that evacuation would be a technical nightmare of such proportions that it would make Meridi's evacuation look like a fracking parade exercise. They were constantly under attack, pushing back the hordes with ever-increasing difficulty despite the advantage the cathedral granted them. Those who weren't on the front lines were collapsed on the floor, trying to sleep despite the sounds of battle or eating the ration packs Erasmus had stored in the cathedral as part of his contingency plans. Those who were either too stressed or scared, and he could smell their fear, despite the fact that they were all doing an admirable job of holding it in so far, were kneeling at the foot of the Emperor's image, praying for strength, the continuation of his protection, and, Erasmus suspected, a quick death. Extraction in battle situations were always a delicate matter, and this was far from the best situation. There were different types of units amongst those who needed extraction, at varying states of exhaustion, with a wavering morale and under constant enemy pressure. Fortunately the undead didn't have any anti-aircraft weapons, at least, none Erasmus' men had seen. But unless Menelaus was ready to deploy considerable resources in order to bomb the undead and push them back long enough, any attempt at evacuation would result in less than 20% of the survivors being rescued while the rest were overwhelmed by the horde. and if the chapter master chose to use this much aircraft to save Erasmo's survivors, the traitors would see it from orbit. They probably wouldn't use orbital bombardment. Hitting flying targets from orbit was a lot more difficult than standing or walking ones, and there was always the danger of the entire planet collapsing in the warp, but he doubted that the bastard Archon hadn't a plan to take advantage of that. So far, the traitors hadn't seemed to have much in the way of military aircraft, beyond Legion Thunderhawks and Stormbirds and a panoply of civilian carriers, but that didn't mean they hadn't something else hidden in that blasted ship of theirs. If Erasmus had been among Menelaus' command staff, he would have advised to abandon the evacuation altogether. Too many risks, for too little gain. 50 Astartes and hundreds of hardwired fighters were a valuable asset, but the Forsaken Sons had to know that the Loyalists could try to rescue them now. They would have a plan for that. It would have torn his heart to do it, but he would have done it anyway. Such was the way of the Sons of Calth, practical in the service of the ideals of the Imperium, but these ideals couldn't be allowed to put in danger the practical greater goal. In this case, the greater goal was the defense of Paraxis, and if it involved letting Talixorn's defenders to die, then Erasmus knew what choice Menelaus had to make. But if the humans realized it, it wouldn't be pretty. It could even cause some of them to turn traitors in the misguided hope that the Forsaken Sons would spare them. Perhaps the traitors would have if this was a conventional siege, if only so that they would be able to corrupt the renegades and turn them into their tools, but here, they were surrounded by mindless hordes. Any betrayal would be short-lived indeed. "Sir," called one of the mortals. He was monitoring their small communication center, receiving reports from the squads placed at the cathedral's few openings. Such was the size of the building that it was quicker, not to mention a lot safer, to use radio rather than messengers, despite the strain it placed on their already severely overworked power generators. Squad 14 reports a new group of undead approaching entry point Gamma 3. There is a plague born with them. ETA is at 40 minutes, at that speed. Entry point Gamma 3, that was the broken vitrail on the southern wall, the highest of several ones that had once depicted the story of the unification of Terra. They had barred the openings, of course, but their defenses there were still thinner than the solid walls of the cathedral. If there was a plague born, then the humans may need the help of space marines in case they didn't manage to shoot the abomination down before it reached them. Activating his own armor's Vox system, the commander of Talixorn's last resistance against the forces of chaos called to his flying team. 40 minutes was plenty of time to get into position, but Gamma 3 required specific preparations. "Argus," he began, "I have another task for you." Mikhail held his court on one of the Hand of Ruin's many empty decks. The walls still bore the traces of the Exodus, this long journey whose tales were quickly becoming legends amongst the crew. Traces of claws and bolt impacts formed a tapestry on the steel walls, telling the story of the battles that had taken part on this particular deck. Part of him wished that he had been here when the ship had sailed the tides of the warp with no control while the Sea of Souls howled, for the battles fought then must have been as glorious as unique. But the greater part knew that he would have most likely been torn apart and his soul obliterated, and what an unseemly end that would have been for a champion of Slaanesh. Neverborn were far more dangerous foes than the thugs and imperial soldiers he had fought so far. One day, though, he would take part in such a battle. When he was powerful enough to stand on the same ground as the Astartes, he would claim glory such as no mortal had ever known. Already he was more than merely human, transformed by the craft of the Fleshmasters and the favor of the Dark Prince. He knew that amongst the many who had been taken for experimentation, he was a unique success. The blood of a god flowed through his veins, and when he closed his eyes he could hear the distant call of the source of his genetic alterations. A great creature of perfect beauty, waiting for its chosen sons on a world hidden from all but those found worthy. The Fleshmasters had infused him with the mortal essence of that divine entity, and he had been judged deserving of it. The mere thought of it sent shivers of withdrawal across his flesh as he imagined the reward of pleasure that would be bestowed upon him when he rose to the full height of his potential. He was still far, far from the White Naga, however, both in the physical sense and in the metaphysical one. His dreams of the Dark Prince's greatest champion were dim, for his mind still lacked the ability to truly perceive the true glory of Slaanesh, and his body, while far above those of the human slaves that he had gathered around him, was still an age away from perfection. One day, though, Mikhail shook himself from his thoughts and looked at his surrounding again. He had to admit that his court was still lacking compared to what he had seen on the walls of Paraxis Beta's great temple, let alone the glorious images of the White Naga. A handful of survivors from the Garrison World's rebels had formed the core of his group, with some even having belonged to the same cell as he. They had seen him talk with Lord Arkan himself, and knew that he had the favor of Slunch. Others had come from the cannon fodder gathered by the Forsaken Sons on the worlds they had conquered, who had heard of his dealings with Jacaerys and of the elevated position he enjoyed among those who had undergone the Fleshmaster's experiments. There were several dozens of them present in the room, and hundreds more across the rest of the ship. All of them wore the emblem of Slunch on their clothes or tattooed on their skin. A few had branded themselves with it through fire or blade. All of them were dirty, and rank of sweat, various drugs, and other scents that formed an atmosphere that was both intoxicating and repelling. About half of them were lying down, fallen into unconsciousness after whatever last thrill they had sought. Some would probably never rise again, dead in their slumber from the abuse of the substances they had consumed in search of yet more sensations. Mikhail didn't care. Those who walked the path of Slunch risked death at every turn, and the risk itself only heightened the pleasure of the few who could reach its elusive end. The dead had proven their worthlessness to the Dark Prince, and would thus have been useless to him anyway. A commotion near one of the entrances of the room drew his attention away from his examination. He looked up, and saw one silhouette stride through the open gate and into the space where those who wanted an audience with Mikhail came, wishing to join his group. The newcomer, however, showed none of the humility and respect that characterized these supplicants. Despite the alien features that marked it as entirely separate from the human genome, the confidence its posture radiated was plain for all to see. The Xenos looked like an Eldar, and the others were reacting to it as such, but Mikhail could see clearly that it wasn't one of the soul-broken. With senses that he still didn't fully understand, he could feel the aura of Slunch's favor radiating from the humanoid, and the knowledge he had gleaned of the Dark Prince told him that no Eldar would, or, rather, could, follow the blessed path of she who thirsts. Any descendant of those who had turned from the glory of the youngest god was marked with his eternal hatred, and would only ever be granted forgiveness when its death brought its soul to its rightful owner among the Chaos gods. He knew this creature's kind, but it was impossible for it to be there. He had seen the aliens like in the visions of the temple, on Paraxis Beta, and he knew well that they had been brought to extinction by the Imperium. Unless, I see that the efforts of Lord Jacaerys have been successful, he called out to the alien, voicing the most likely hypothesis. The Fleshmaster hadn't told him why they had needed to go to the temple, only that their objective lay deep within its chambers. But since the only things they had taken back were the remains of the entombed Xenos, it didn't take much thought to understand where the creature before him had come from. Still, that didn't explain the confidence in the creature's eyes. This wasn't a clone raised from the bones of a long-decayed corpse, fast-grown through either science or sorcery and let loose inside the ship, but a being of experience, used to power and domination over all it looked upon. It took him several heartbeats to get an explanation, during which the alien simply stared at him, a slight smile on its thin lips. I must admit, though, Mikhail continued, that I am surprised he actually managed to return you from the dead. It had been months since the firstborn was returned to the world, Monkey, said the Xenos in a voice that was both sweet as wine and filled with contempt. It spoke in Gothic, but with an obvious reluctance and a thick accent. I would have thought that even one such as you, dwelling in the bowels of this ship alongside the vermin, would have heard about my kind by now. Mikhail kept his irritation at the barb hidden. That was true, he should have known that Jacaerys had done it. In fact, now that he thought about it, he remembered hearing rumors about some alien being brought before Arkan on the ship's very bridge, in the sight of hundreds of crew. But he had been busy these last weeks gathering the army that he both desired for himself and had been ordered by Arkan to assemble. He had forgotten to keep an eye and an ear out for any change in the bigger picture, and now it seemed that this mistake was going to cost him. But never mind that. I am Lurakas, declared the Xenos without waiting for the renegade soldier's reply. And I have come to demand that you and yours submit to the authority of my kind. There was a moment of complete silence as the assembled cultists waited for their leader's reply to this challenge of his authority. Mikhail wasn't certain he had heard right. Something within him was refusing the mere possibility that he had actually heard correctly, that, somehow, everything he had claimed as his own was going to be taken away from him just like this. It was a sensation he had never felt before, and yet it didn't trigger the rush of pleasure such things were supposed to cause in his altered brain. These are my men, Mikhail protested at last. I lead them. Lorakis looked at the cultists and slaves that he had gathered around him, and sneered. "Oh, you can continue leading them. We only want you to join our assault on one of the cities of the world below. It is the will of Archon himself that you do so, for he apparently believes that you are, like us, blessed by the goddess, and that your help will be of use to us. I find both of these claims difficult to believe, but my kind owes a great debt to him, and it would be ungrateful not to listen to his words. But first," said the Xenos while holding up a hand, "I think that we need to ensure you understand your place in this little operation. The Marines who will fight with us will do as they please, but not you. You will do as we command. Your forces will deploy as we see fit." "I abide to the will of the Awakened One, of course," answered Mikhail, internally seething at the creature's arrogance. "Then show it." "What do you mean?" Lorakis was smiling now, the sight utterly alien and unsettling. It was a smile that brought black lips several centimeters too far to be human, and the teeth it showed were pointed and razor-sharp. "Kneel." Grinding his teeth, Mikhail knelt before the shy Ilat. He loathed having to prostrate before any other being, but the alien was clearly higher than him in both Slunch's and Archon's esteem, and he wasn't even sure that his servants would side with him if he tried to refuse the order. Having his leadership over the cult stolen from him like this grated his pride, but he swore to himself that one day, he would not only take it back, but wipe the arrogant smirk off Lorakis' face. Argus and his brothers were fighting the undead atop a chasm several kilometers deep, held aloft by thick cables bound around their torsos and linked to the cathedral's strongest pillars. They were standing perpendicularly to the wall, so that from their point of view the zombies appeared to be crawling along the wall toward them, seeking to reach the entrance above the Space Marines, or, from their own perspective, behind their line. He would much rather stand alongside the mortals who manned the opening, but the small platform behind the broken vitriol was too fragile for Astartes to stand upon for a prolonged period of time. They had had to walk one by one through it and let themselves be bound by the humans. "We look ridiculous," voxed Alec, while crushing one more undead under his ceramite boot. "This is no way to fight, brothers. If we still had remembrances, I would force them to vow never to mention that particular detail when they wrote the tale of our exploits here." The sergeant was forced to admit that he agreed with his brother. Fighting in a gravity-variable environment wasn't new to the Astartes. The situation was actually quite close to a handful of boarding actions he had been part of, when the gravity engine of the ship had started to malfunction and only his magnetic boots had prevented him from falling down a corridor that, a few seconds earlier, had been perfectly horizontal. But being suspended like they were, locked in place and with the knowledge that a drop of several minutes followed by a most undignified death awaited them if the cables failed was still a novel experience. It also made them look quite ridiculous as well, like some demented puppets suspended over the void, butchering anything that reached them. "It's also most definitely not something written within the Codex," the son of Calth continued. "I am not certain whether if our beloved Primarch ever learn of this, he would laugh and congratulate us, or be furious for ignoring his teachings in favor of such a tactic. It is an effective way to dispose of our foes," he answered his battle brother while kicking a plague zombie off the wall, watching it fall for a second, flailing around uselessly. "How we look while doing so is irrelevant. Guilliman would approve, brother." And it was true, in both cases. The plague zombies had absolutely no way of fighting back the Astartes as they crushed and kicked them. The only risk was that one of them could manage to get a hold of a son of Calth, and that if enough did it, the unfortunate Astartes would be torn apart by their hands, armor or not. But with the squad mates covering each other, they could easily do this all day and not expend a single shot at their precious ammunition stores. Even the humans, mostly armed with las rifles, needed to spare their shots, for they had been able to salvage precious little of their reserves beyond what Erasmus had stocked in the cathedral in advance. There was still a group of humans at their back, or rather, some 20 meters above them, to take down any undead who somehow managed to slip past the Sons of Calth, as they could hardly turn to destroy it. The undead who reached the Astartes were crushed under ceramite boots and fists. They had left their chainswords in the cathedral along with the rest of their weapons save for the combat knife they all carried. It was both gruesome, repetitive and, to be honest, disgusting. But it worked, and even the plague-born, the loathsome leaders of the undead, couldn't do much to defend themselves in that situation. "I see the target," voxed another of Argus' squad mates. 100 meters below us. The plague-born looked different from the zombies. Its body appeared to be female. Argus wasn't as ignorant of normal human biology as many of his brothers, but the decay made it hard to be sure, and unlike the mindless undead, its face still showed an expression. In this instance, it was filled with hatred as it glared at the space marines above it. It was rising faster than the undead following it, its limbs filled with unholy strength and its mind capable of finding the best holds in the wall. When it reached Argus, however, the sergeant was more than ready for it. "Die," he snarled, bringing down his foot on the abomination's skull. "Just die already." Ceramite met bone, and the superior strength of Argus' leg muscles cracked the skull apart between the boot and the stone wall. As soon as the creature's brain was destroyed, the undead it had led started slowing down, several of them falling from their climbing positions. The sons of Calth kicked a few more of them down, before starting to haul themselves up in order to return inside the cathedral. Scraping the Plague-born's remains from his boot on the wall, Argus took a look down the wall. There were more undead coming up, there always were. But it didn't look like they were led by a Plague-born, just more mindless corpses trying to climb up with broken limbs and shattered bones, pushed by the unfathomable will that held them enslaved. His brothers would have already checked it, of course, but he wanted to make sure himself. "Argus," came Erasmo's voice, crackling over the vox. Despite the short distance separating the sergeant from his captain, the warp storm above was playing havoc on their communication equipment. "We have established communication with the rest of the chapter. They are sending evacuation crafts as we speak." "Despite your advice to the contrary?" "Yes. Menelaus claims that the impact abandoning us would have on morale would be more damaging than the potential losses in trying to save us, but I think we both know his true reasons. He is too sentimental. Though I agree with you, he may be right nonetheless, Captain. There is a reason he is chapter master and we aren't. Perhaps. Your task on Gamma 3 is done. Return inside the cathedral, Argus." Erasmus suddenly went silent. The Vox link was still open, and Argus hadn't heard any of the telltale signs that the legionary he had been talking to had been brutally killed, something which had occurred all too often in his life. "Captain." "Sir?" "Erasmus, what's wrong?" In his meditation cell aboard the Hand of Ruin, Arsum was experiencing a rare moment of peace. He was still in his armor, though he had removed his helmet, breathing the recycled air of the ship without his armor's filters. It reeked of cleaning chemicals and the faint scent of warp corruption. Right now, he had no bargain to honor, no ritual to perform, no duty placed upon him by the Awakened One. His performance during the battle for Merides had been less than stellar, but he had learned from the trick the sons of Calth's librarians had used there, and next time, the Coven would be prepared for it, not that the Loyalists would use it again. They knew that the Forsaken Sons wouldn't fall for it twice. Arkan's plans continued to advance, but for now it fell to others to prosecute them. Arsum's orders were to keep his strength for the final battle, whenever that was supposed to happen. To that end, he had retreated to his chamber, and sat down inside the ritual circle that kept his mind safe from the predations of the Neverborn. It was probably a needless precaution, since the Herald of Blood had begun to haunt him. The minor manifestations of the warp had left him alone, but some habits were hard to break, and it would be foolish to rely on the implied protection of a demon, even if that one was bound to him. Here in the circle, even the tempting demon of Khorne, and by the eye of Magnus, he still had difficulty accepting that a creature as subtle had ever been born among the blood god's choirs, couldn't disturb him. There was a knock on his door. Isolated as he was by the circle, Arsum couldn't use his psychic sight to determine who it was, but he didn't need to. His other senses were enough to identify his visitor. The sound of a single heartbeat indicated that it was a human, various pheromones that it was a male, and the vague but unmistakable scent of blood that clung to his every spore despite all attempts at decontamination gave away the last piece of his identity. "Enter, Balthazar." The door slid open, and the former inmate of Paraxis Gamma entered the sorcerer's lair. He still wore the same patchwork armor that he had when Arsum had met him in High Vanister, and his demon-possessed lasgun was hung on his back. Even within the circle, Arsum could taste the weapon's hunger in the very air. It longed to be used, to kill, but at the same time, it was intelligent enough to realize that if its carrier used it now, he would die immediately. Idly, the sorcerer wondered how many of its owners had died before it had understood that there were times when it was better not to shoot. A great many, he suspected, each one feeding their death to the weapon's demon spirit. "My lord," said Balthazar, bowing before Asim sitting form. Politeness and respect were rare things amongst criminals, but Asim knew that Balthazar had been both a smart criminal and a successful one before his luck had gone sour. "You have questions," noted Asim, seeing the hesitation in the hitman's posture. "Yes, my lord," admitted the human. "Feel free to ask them. Ever has illuminating others been the pleasure of my bloodline? I think it's the pride of our father in us." Wisely, Balthazar chose not to comment on that. Even if he was still new to the Forsaken Sons and the different gene lines that formed them, he knew that the Thousand Sons had more reason to claim the Warband's name than most. Instead, he asked what he had been wondering since the sorcerer had brought him to the ship, after the battle for Merides had settled down. "Why am I here, Lord?" Asim raised an eyebrow. "Are you discontent to be here, Balthazar?" "Of course not, Lord. It is an honor, and this place is far more interesting than staying in the ruins of another hive, but I wonder why it is you decided to bring me here after we both survived the battle." The Astartes were silent for a moment. When he answered, it was with another question of his own. "Tell me, Balthazar, who am I? From where you stand, what do I appear to be?" "You are Lord Asim of the Forsaken Sons," answered the human, uneasy. He had talked with mob bosses before being caught and dragged to Paraskxiskama, and various psychos when the world had fallen to rebellion, but he knew without a shadow of doubt that the sorcerer was far more dangerous than any of them. That kind of question was just loaded with potentially deadly mistakes, but trying to lie would only make things worse. Besides, he wanted an answer to his question. "You are the master of the Coven, those of the Forsaken Sons who can call upon the powers of the warp. Lord Arkan considers you to be one of his. I suppose it would be Inner Circle. You are the one who sent me and the others from Paraskxiskama to the capital world, through means I would rather not dwell upon. And from what I have heard when we were in Anastar, you can make bargains with demons and bind them into the flesh of other Astartes. You are powerful, my lord. Very, very powerful, in a different way than the Awakened One. His power comes from those who will obey him, whereas your power comes from within yourself." Asim chuckled. "That's flattering, but it would be better for you to forget your foolish ideas about Arkan. His command of the Warband is his main asset in the war against the false emperor, but do not believe him to be individually weak for a moment. It is his name that echoes through the Sea of Souls, not mine. His is the will that drives the Warband, that forged us into brothers in hate well before we were only comrades in defeat. I will bear that in mind, my lord. But you haven't answered my question. Why bring me here? There are thousands of mortal fighters on this ship already. I will admit to being stronger than all the unmodified ones and many of those who passed under the Fleshmaster's scalpels, but still, you have no need of me here." "Indeed, I don't," confirmed the sorcerer. "Answer me this, do you know of the 4 gods of chaos?" Balthazar shrugged. "I have heard about them. Some of the word-bearers have come down to the human decks to search for converts. Khorne, Zionch, Nurgle, and Slanch, right? They sung their names and titles, to see if one of us reacted to it." Asim snorted. Like all Thousand Sons, he disliked the blind worship that the Sons of Lorga showed for the ruinous powers. The dark gods were abominations, tumors of hatred born in the Sea of Souls as reflections of the sins of every sentient life to have ever existed in the galaxy. Worshipping them reeked of ignorance, but even then the Sorcerer Lord had to admit that the warriors of the 17th knew much about what they called the primordial truth. "Then I do not need to tell you of them, and can answer your real question. It is curiosity that guided my hand, Balthazar. You, like all those I warped across space on the penal world, bear the mark of Khorne on your soul. Not the one given to the Blood God's champions, but your very essence has been altered by the powers that held this now shattered world in their grasp. But where most of the others have been consumed by the bloodlust, or barely capable of controlling it, you appear to be unchanged. You were already a killer and a borderline sociopath before the scions of the Blood God began to reshape your soul in their blunt, effective way, so perhaps it protected your capacity for reason. You are a contradiction, Balthazar, a living paradox of chaos. I am afflicted by something similar, and I thought that by studying you, I may be able to shed some light on my own situation." Asim saw the tension rising in the former hitman's body as his mind processed what the Astartes had just told him. He didn't move, he didn't need to. If the mortal was foolish enough to draw his weapon, There were 100 different ways the sorcerer could neutralize him before he shot, several of them weren't even deadly. But he didn't think it would come to that. "You brought me here as an experiment subject?" he asked, very carefully. "Not really. More as someone deserving to be observed. The warp has a myriad plans, Balthazar, plans stretching into eternity and involving all souls in the galaxy, but even the architect of fate reuses the same plots sometimes. It is rare enough for Khorne and Zyonch to work in concert, and for the same thing to happen twice in the same theater of the great game. There has to be a link between your condition and mine. I am not marked by the god of change," Balthazar almost hissed, his temper artificially agitated by his rifle in answer to Asim's words. The dark gods were ever so possessing of their pawns, and their servants, as insignificant shards of their consciousness, shared that trait, but the weapon wasn't the only reason for his reaction. Even if the hitman didn't realize the source of his sudden ire, he was still instinctively rejecting the claim that another god, that the one he had sworn his soul to, consciously or not, may have interfered with his existence. "But I am, no matter that I have renounced my father. And it was I that cast you from your prison to Paraxis Alpha. Like it or not, the architect of fate had a hand in your current situation. All of us," he gestured with his hand to designate the walls of the room, implying that he was talking about the entire warband and not just the two of them, "were made into what we are by the great game. I know that I cannot escape from it, but I will understand what part in it the dark gods intend for me." "And you think that I can help you in that?" deduced Balthazar, the tension in him diminishing slightly. "I think that by observing you, by seeing how the warp acts around you and shapes you, I can learn about the great game. I am privy to secret knowledge of considerable might, human. I can barter with the Neverborn, and bind them to the service of my lord. As the representative of Archon in the etheric planes, I can make bargains with the scions of the dark gods in his name. It is therefore important that I understand the ebbs and flows of the great game, for it is one that involves every single demon in the warp." "What about what you did in the Underhive of Anaster?" the human asked again, after a pause to consider what the sorcerer had just told him. "With the demon of shadows that looked like the War Master. That was a bargain, was it not?" "It was. I granted the wish of Aloran, foolish as it may be, for it was the will of the dark gods. In return for this service, they restored me from the damage I had endured when performing the ritual that sent you and the others to Paraxis Alpha." "Foolish? I have seen him fight at Meridus. Even if he ended up losing, he still did much damage to the bastards in blue and green." "You didn't see him fight. You saw the shadow fight. His mind was completely overpowered by the demon from the moment he approached the Sons of K'alf. Even with the barrier in position to keep me from the warp, I heard his psychic cry when he was relegated to the backseat of his own body. He might have recovered from it, but his soul will bear the scars of that loss of control until he dies, and since the shadow is still within him, it probably won't be the last ones. He thought he knew the risks, but every time he loses control, the hold of the demon on his flesh will grow stronger, until the mortal soul within him is snuffed out by the Neverborn. From the moment he accepted the deal, there were only two fates possible for him: death in battle, or complete destruction at the claws of the demon sharing his body. Now tell me, how isn't that foolish?" Balthazar remained silent. Not only did he not have an answer to the sorcerer's query, he could hear the bitterness in the Astarte's voice. This wasn't just about Aloran, at least not for Asim. "I think that's the lesson you and I, and probably the rest of the warband too, should all learn from that," Asim finished, looking straight into Balthazar's eyes. "In this galaxy, shortcuts to power are rarely worth the risk." Began the captain, before trailing off. Despite all his training and experience, what he was seeing was giving him pause. For several hours now, thousands and thousands of undead had gathered on one of the spires near the cathedral. They had massed on its shattered peak like a flood, filling every corner of space available to the point that many had burst apart under the pressure. The cathedral's defenders had kept watch over the gathering, unsure of what their enemies were planning. Now, the plan of the enemy was becoming clear, but no less unbelievable. Atop the spire, on a slab of rockcrete that reached above the teeming mass of walking corpses, stood the rotten tech priest that had been noticed leading the assault on the safe zone weeks ago. The animated corpses were massing at the top of the ruined spire like a single, blasphemous mass that was beginning to reach out toward the cathedral. Like some unholy, nightmarish construct, the bodies linked with one another to form the structure of a bridge between the two buildings. It was as thick as the one the Loyalists had detonated, and grossly following the same form, but was made of rotten flesh instead of stone. Arcs of warp energy were dancing between the growing bridge and the silhouette of the corrupt Magus, fusing bones together to add stability to the structure. "Blood of the Emperor," whispered Erasmus, unable to believe what his armor's display was showing him. He wasn't the only one. All across the sections of the cathedral where the fighters could watch the unfolding madness, there was a pause, as incredulity battled against what their own senses were telling them. The Plague-born stopped in awe, amazed at the power at the control of the one who had lifted them above their weak humanity, and the undead accompanying them reacted to their emotions and stopped moving, several dozens of them freezing mid-climb and falling down. The rational minds of the cathedral's defenders had been painfully stretched by what life had thrown their way so far, but this still made them doubt their senses for a second before their survival instincts reasserted themselves and told them that yes, this is real and it can kill you. "Erasmus. What's happening?" Arga's frantic voice was what drew his own attention back to the present. Everything snapped back into place inside his mind, the sheer impossibility of what he was beholding forgotten. It was happening right now. The how wasn't important. What mattered, what was practical, was what he could do to resolve the situation they now found themselves in, with its new parameters. First, he had to get all the firepower he could at his immediate disposal, for when the undead broke inside. "The enemy is making a bridge between spires with the undead. Get back there, now." Ignoring his sergeant's shocked reply, the captain of the Sons of Calth focused all of his attention on the threat. The bridge was blatantly ignoring several laws of physics that should have made its existence impossible. Obviously, there was warpcraft at work here, and, just as obviously, it emanated from the traitor of the Mechanicum that directed the whole thing like some demented orchestra conductor. "Can we shoot it down?" shouted Erasmus over the vox. "Wait, forget that. They would just pull up more material, and we don't have the ammo to waste." He quickly switched channels. "Squad 5, can you get a shot on that bastard tech priest?" "Negative, Captain," came the reply of his few remaining scouts, stationed atop one of the cathedral's towers. "The air currents are swirling around him. There is some sorcery at work here, protecting the creature's existence." Erasmus swore violently, before calling for a general report from all fronts. The answers he got didn't please him in the slightest. The undead were still climbing on all other fronts. If Erasmus redirected his troops to hold the gate, they would simply strike at them from behind. Could the holy ground prevent the zombies from entering? No way to check without taking considerable risk. He had to consider it couldn't. So, he could only count on himself, Arga's flying squad and whatever forces he could force to stand from those currently resting. It wouldn't be enough. Perhaps if all they had to face were undead and plague-born, but there were corrupt marines behind these doors. They were a threat, for all that the ruin had claimed them. The doors of the cathedral were closed, heavy panels of wood, behind which the survivors had piled every piece of rubble and furniture they had found. Atop it, a dozen humans had been firing down at the undead trying to break it open. They were now directing their weapons at the bridge but, obeying Erasmus' orders with admirable restraint, they weren't opening fire. "Argus," said Erasmus as the sergeant and his squad approached him. "They will break the door soon, don't ask me how. They must have something prepared. Get into position." As soon as he had finished his sentence, there was a great sound, like rotten meat hitting something hard. The bridge had made contact with the extremity of the cathedral's spire, and now Talixorn's survivors knew they had entered the endgame of their resistance. Erasmus made his decision, and opened a wide vox channel to all of them. "Hear my words, brothers and sisters. The enemy is closing in on us, using sorcery most foul to reach this sacred ground. But do not despair. For not only do we fight under the Emperor's eyes, but our allies are even now drawing closer, bringing with them our deliverance. We will hold till they arrive, and with their help bring words of our defiance to the others who yet fight against the hated ones. Stand your ground and fight. Come death and ruin, we shall not be defeated. Our souls are under the Emperor's protection. Let the enemy know the true meaning of defiance as they come." There was a cheer in reply to his words, and the captain of the Sons of Calth couldn't help but feel proud of them all, mortals and Astartes alike. Rot spread across the wooden gates at an alarming speed. In less than 10 seconds, they began to fall apart, and the pile of rubble that had been pressing on them collapsed onto the bridge of decaying flesh. The impact broke the structure's extremity, throwing hundreds of corpses into the abyss, but it wasn't nearly enough. More arcs of warp lightning struck the remainder of the bridge, and a new influx of rotten bodies replaced those who had been cast down, linking the ruined spire with the edge of the cathedral once more. At the other extremity of the bridge, the undead began to advance, crushing the flesh of their kindred under their foot as they did so. For now, only the plague zombies were advancing, the corrupt Marines remaining where they stood, in a grotesque mirror of the Loyalists' own defensive line. The walking corpses moved past them, instinctively detecting their presence and avoiding them, like water flowing around rocks. "Come then, you miserable hellspawns," spat Argus as his squad gathered at his side, forming a barrier of ceramite against the tide of rotting, wailing flesh. "Come and find the salvation you deserve." 24 menials had lost their lives in the last weeks, forcing Paranefer to call for a more reliable kind of assistant. His work still couldn't be revealed to the rest of the Fleshmasters, for it was still incomplete and liable to cause turmoil even amongst the ranks of the amoral apothecaries. But even if he couldn't ask his colleagues for help, he still needed assistance with the more mundane aspects of his craft, and the servant was exactly what he needed. He had recalled the creature from Santorius, where one of the other Fleshmasters had dragged it to assist in his own experiments with the various mutants found amongst their mortal allies there. His colleague down there had the Magus of the Cult of Mutability to assist him. He could spare one lowly minion, even if the servant was, somehow, unique. All attempts made by Paranefer to find the data about its creation had failed, and he couldn't remember the name of the Fleshmaster who had performed them, which meant that he had never known it, as he possessed an eidetic memory. That was a shame, because he could definitely use more of its kind, despite its unassuming appearance. It was capable of understanding almost any instruction and never failed to complete the tasks it was given. Unlike the human serfs, so far the servant had managed to survive both the dangers of the lab, those of the Hand of Ruin, and the temper of its master, which always grew hot when he encountered yet another setback in his great work. Those of Magnus' bloodline were usually calm, collected souls, searching for illumination even if it could only be found in the darkest places. But what Paranefer was working on was slowly grinding even the legendary Prosperine patients to dust. Still, since the servant had begun to work for him, he hadn't run into any hurdle that a few minutes of thinking hadn't solved, even if he had to admit to himself that he couldn't remember where he had read some of the notions that had involved. Part of him was worried that his eidetic memory may, in fact, be deteriorating through prolonged exposition to the warp. He dismissed the worry, though. The past didn't matter, for it held nothing but the burn of failure and the bitterness of loss. It was the future that mattered, and in this room he was crafting the weapons that would shape that of the Forsaken Sons. 9 tanks were held on the walls of his lab, far from the eyes of the rest of the Fleshmasters. Each was filled with life support liquid, that could be breathed and sustain whatever form of life was kept within. The sorcerer had taken these pods from the ship's apothecarians, where they were once used to keep wounded warriors in a state of suspended animation while their bodies healed. With a few modifications, they also made perfect artificial wombs within which his creations could form and grow. Only 5 of the tanks were used at the moment. The other 4 were being cleaned of the remnants of their previous occupants, after a small unbalance in the cocktail of arcane energies and growth stimulants fed into them had caused them to dissolve into primordial goo. An annoying setback, but now Paranefer was fairly confident that he knew exactly the dosage of warp energy he could pump into his creations without the rampant mutations overwhelming their metabolism. His knowledge of the flesh change that had plagued his legion before Ahriman's spell had, according to Archon, preserved them from the attentions of the god of change, had provided the basis for his work. But for all their flaws, his creations were a step above Astartes' genetics. The DNA Paranefer had collected from his samples hadn't been enough to clone the Primarchs correctly, so he had resorted to his other training and replaced the missing sequences with what passed for genes in incarnated demonkind, gathered from the flesh of several demon hosts he had created as an experiment during the heresy. As a result of their dual origins, the clones could endure far more random and not so random alterations to their genotype before breaking down. Trial and error was the only way to discover just how much raw warp energy was too much for them, and how much was too little for the twisted parodies of life to continue their existence. The creatures needed the chaotic energy, they were too far from any stable living pattern to exist in pure reality. They weren't exactly demons, but neither were they creatures of flesh. Instead, They existed somewhere between these two states, and it was Paranefa's work to keep them that way until their growth was complete. Right now, the 5 creations were kept in a state of suspended animation by both mundane and sorcerous means, their brains locked in stasis. The sorcerer wasn't sure that they had the potential for sentience, but he wasn't about to risk discovering if the soulless husks he had created were aware of their condition. He might have been dabbling in powers beyond the comprehension of mortals and creating blasphemies against every single moral principle of the Imperium, but he wasn't stupid. When he finally completed his work, the creatures would be unleashed in the middle of the enemy, with anything or personnel the Forsaken Sons cared about as far from them as possible. Apart from their size, which was still only at a human level since their growth wasn't yet complete, each of the warped clones was different from the others, displaying their own variations of their original's traits. One, whose base gene code had come from the 9th Legion's martyred Primarch, showed the bone structure of a pair of wings, barely more than a forearm's length and devoid of any feathers. Another, created from a drop of blood of Vulcan, had black scales instead of skin, and a crest of bone emerged from its spine like some Saurus of terrors long gone past. A third, the one Paranefa, in a quite inappropriate show of irony, was most fond of, had been born out of 6th Legion's gene seed, and was a monstrous beast, covered in fur, with claws that left marks on the pod when they drifted too close and fangs that forced its jaw to remain perpetually open. The fourth was almost lost to mutation, little more than an ever-changing mass of flesh and limbs and faces, but it still lived, and so Paranefa preferred to keep it as an observation sample. In contrast, the last clone looked utterly normal, with its dimension being the only thing distinguishing it from a normal human infant. But Paranefa could feel the corruption writhing beneath its skin, the organs and blood vessels reconfiguring themselves continually under the touch of chaos. This one was the hardest to keep sedated, as its biology kept evolving and developing immunity to the cocktails employed to this effect. An entire cogitator was dedicated to altering its pod's chemicals, analyzing and interpreting the changes in the creature's body and responding to them in real time. Looking at them together, Paranefa noted another trait they shared, the peaceful expression on their misshapen visages. Kept asleep by the chemicals flowing through their bloodstream and their memory empty, they knew nothing of their own monstrosity or of the cruelty of the galaxy that had spawned them. In all the years of his life, the sorcerer had seen almost all the Primarchs, during the Great Crusade or the heresy that had followed. He had seen them talk as they decided the fate of entire worlds, and witnessed their rage in the heat of battle. But he had never seen any of them with such an expression. "Great One," said the servant, its voice dragging Paranefa's attention away from the life pods for a moment. To his surprise, there was actual curiosity in the tone of the creature. It was hard to tell, but spending time in its company had allowed the Fleshmaster to understand its mind's workings rather well. "These beings," it said, gesturing toward the 5 monstrous godlings, sleeping in their cradles of forbidden science and mad genius. Master's children. They are not like the Master, or like the other great ones. What will you call them? What should I call them, when they awake?" Paranefa took a moment to look at his creations again. Here were weapons of unthinkable potential, forged from the stolen lore of a living god and refashioned through the power of the warp and the insanity of the dark mechanicum's forbidden sciences. Not even he knew just what they would be capable of once they were complete. He knew they would never be the equals of the Primarchs, but his mind still boggled with possibilities. It was all too likely that the current batch wouldn't survive, that some flaw in his work would reveal itself and force him to start all over again. So far, he hadn't thought about the matter raised by the servant, for despite all his confidence in his own abilities he still wasn't certain that what he was attempting would really succeed in the end. And yet, names were important, that much was known to any sorcerer. Names were the basis of a self, the foundation for the identities that formed both in the Materium and in the Sea of Souls. Hold the true name of any demon and you could control it, though it would resent such control and do its best to destroy you and all you held dear. Could it be that the fact his creations hadn't a name disturbed the balance of etheric energies he was trying to achieve within their cloned flesh? It seemed absurd, but Paranefa had learned not to underestimate the importance of symbolism when dealing with the warp. It was irritating how it forced sorcerers to act overly dramatically and consider the implications of every little detail, often to the point of seeing portents in meaningless details, but it was the price for their power. "I will call them the Children of Woe," he decided out loud. Yes, that name would do. It would reflect the reaction that would no doubt be that of the loyal Astartes if they ever learned of the clone's nature, quickly followed by a terrible rage, of course. And as for what you should call them, it would be better if you never have an opportunity to do so, little one. I doubt they will be the kind to enjoy conversation. If you say so, master, answered the servant, lowering its head in servile deference. Lycaon's eyes snapped open. He was the last librarian amongst the survivors of Talexorn. All the others had died fighting the Horde, each encountering a different doom. Khalees had been torn apart limbs from limbs after he exhausted his powers to save 100 civilians from the ravenous dead. Tullius had shot himself when he had felt a demon of plague dig into his soul and try to take over his body. Nairas had fallen into the abyss around the cathedral when he had underestimated the backlash of using his psychic powers to push down a grape of plague-born. Of the mortal psychers, none had survived the fall of Talexorn to the walking dead, some of them even succumbing to the dark lure of chaos and joining the ranks of the plague-born, their mortal frames ravaged by the disease just as their souls were rotten from within. He stood alone, but he wasn't without allies. For almost an entire day, Lycaon had meditated, gathering his strength under the cathedral's spiritual protection. He could hear the whispers of angels, created from the hopes and devotion of the thousands who had prayed within these hallowed walls. For all that he personally didn't think of the Emperor as a god, it was a lot more difficult to hold to that belief when his soul was surrounded by the display of his power. He knew, within him, that it was almost certainly nothing more than the psychic resonance of the pilgrim's emotions in the warp. But it was difficult to deny the sensation of divine that enveloped this place. Now it was time for him to act in order to defend this place. He reached out with his mind, linking his very essence to the holy power contained within the building. At once, he felt the intrusion of the corrupt and the lost, the taint of their presence a blight upon the cathedral's immaculate presence. With a ferocious snarl hidden behind his faceplate, he channeled the power of the Emperor's Church, and a wave of pure white flame engulfed the first wave of the walking dead, burning them to nothingness. More came behind those, and this time Lycaon didn't smite them. He needed to conserve the power for as long as he could. That first attack had been to make the Plague Marines and Plague-born wary, to keep them away from the fight for as long as possible. If they thought he could unleash the purifying flame at will, they wouldn't risk their own fallen existences. The first undead to reach past the gate screeched as they burst into flame or came apart, the fell power animating them countered by the holy ground. Even the Plague Marines that came behind them hesitated at the threshold, their armor smoking as they advanced. For a moment, the defenders dared to hope that the Scions of Plague wouldn't be able to enter the cathedral, that the Emperor had delivered unto them their salvation. But then, the tide of the dead parted, revealing the corrupt tech priest that had led the invasion of Talexorn. The creature stopped at the very edge of the sacred field, and held up its two natural arms, thin and wasted things, blackened by tumors and corruption, before pressing them on the very surface of the field. At once, smoke began to rise from its hands, and warp energy poured forth from the exposed mechanical parts of his body. Several of the defenders tried to shoot at the creature, but it was in vain. Every bolt and lust beam was blocked by some manner of force field surrounding it. Behind the defenders, Lycaon screamed in agony as he felt the power of chaos spreading. Still he held on, reinforcing the cathedral's holy ground with his own psychic power, making the icons and symbols all over the building flare with golden fire. For several minutes, the two psychic entities remained in mutual lockdown. But Lycaon was only one librarian, while Farad was currently linked with the miasma of corruption that covered Talexorn entire. Nurgle's eyes had fallen on the unfortunate city, and the god of plague was filling his champion with unholy energies. After a long and painful struggle, something ruptured in Lycaon's brain, and he fell, dead. At the same time, the base of the Emperor's statue cracked ominously, before collapsing and crashing into the cathedral's wall opposite to the entrance. The stone was broken apart, and the entire wall collapsed, revealing the polluted skies and the other spires beyond. The defenders remained immobile, utterly stunned by what had happened. Then, a voice came from the tech priest, but also from many more mouths. "This is the end for you, slaves of the corpse emperor. His power over this ground is broken. His light cannot reach you." They were speaking, the defenders realized in horror. Every mouth in the horde was speaking the same words at the same time, directed by some malign intelligence. Most undead were too decomposed to do anything more than moan, but those whose tongue and teeth were still mostly intact were speaking as one, in a choir of the lost and the damned. Even the undead whose body formed the bridge were wailing, adding their own tormented voices to the unholy song. This wasn't the voice of the corrupt leader of the walking dead. This was the voice of their god, made manifest by the tremendous corruption writhing outside the cathedral, and now that the holy ground had been so thoroughly desecrated, it would soon be within as well. The defenders raised their weapons, prepared to fight to the last and take as many of the rotting things down with them as they could. As the horde was about to crash onto their line, however, the air was torn by the sound of heavy bolters and powerful engines. The first wave of zombies was blasted to shreds by a volley of heavy fire. Stunned, the humans turned, and saw the unmistakable shape of a stormbird through the ruined wall, standing almost still as its weapons ripped the undead apart. Ladders began to fall through the opening, while the stormbird which had just opened fire drew closer, opening its bay. "Space Marines, hold the line!" shouted Erasmus. "The rest of you, go! Get back with the others, old man," Argus managed to say in between two strokes of his blade to one of the few who had chosen to remain while the rest were evacuating. He recognized him, the priest that had been aboard the Lady of the Three Seas, and had kept the demon away with his prayers. Father Colin, he had been called then. "Leave this to us." "This is my flock, Sergeant," said the priest without turning his attention from the slaughter he was inflicting with his chainsword. He had picked up the weapon from one of the fallen scouts. It was still far too big for him, but faith and adrenaline granted strength to his limbs, and the massacre of the undead didn't require any more skill with a blade that did the reaping of a field. His voice was utterly calm and entirely at odds with the situation. Had Argus not been engaged in combat himself, he would probably have been unnerved by the old man's tranquility. "To die so that they may live is my duty and my joy." That was apparently enough for the sergeant. They kept on fighting, while behind them the survivors and sons of Calth who had been stationed away from the gates were being brought aboard the gunships. This wasn't a rout. The Astartes aboard the vessels had established contact with the survivors, and were coordinating the evacuation while Erasmus, Argus' squad and those who were either too wounded or too foolish, Colin wasn't fooling himself about what he was doing, were holding back the tide. Father Colin saw Argus die. The sergeant's head was removed from his shoulders by a single blow from one of the plague marines, one that he hadn't been able to block or dodge as he was locked in place by a mass of undead. A second later, the corrupt marine was slain by a strike of Captain Erasmus, his head cut in twain by the power blade of the son of Calth. He in turn fell, not to another fallen son of Mortarion, but instead blasted out of existence by a discharge of green, sickly light that annihilated half of his body and turned the remaining half into a rapidly decaying husk. And then, the old man found himself face to face with the abomination that had led the attack, the one that, in his dreams, he had seen as responsible for all the horrors that had befallen Talaxorn. He had the time for a single strike with his chain blade, managing to cut into one of the exposed cables, before a blade fixed at the end of a half-metal, half-tentacle mechadendrite pierced right through him. The pain was overwhelming. He felt his consciousness threatening to black out, but clung to his awareness. He still had a chance to stop the monster that was responsible for the horrors that had befallen this city. He tried to lift his left hand, which was holding a plasma grenade he had taken from a fallen son of Calth several days ago. He had thought to use it to take a few more of the dead with him, and deny the great enemy the use of his own corpse, but if he could activate it now, his death would be worth the destruction of the fallen Magus. He saw his arm move, and tried to press the activation rune on the grenade, only to realize that he could no longer feel the weapon. When his arm was high enough, he saw why. Everything below his elbow was gone, having succumbed to rot and fallen on the ground. Glancing down, he saw the grenade amidst a small pile of rotten biomatter. The same corruption was spreading through his other limbs. Already his legs were almost gone, and he was only kept standing by the blade that was piercing through his torso. "You die in vain," said the corrupt tech priest through several vox grills on its body, all of which dripped with poison, like all slaves of the false emperor. "No life given to the emperor is ever lost in vain," riposted the priest, struggling to speak with his guts spilling from his body and the pain of his quickly decaying flesh. "Give yourself to Nurgle," pressed the abomination. "Abandon your foolish belief in the corpse god. He cannot help you. He cannot help anyone, trapped on this throne of lies my former brethren have built for him. Only my lord can save you now." "Never," breathed Father Colin. It was the last word he would ever speak. His body finally shut down, and his soul slipped free of its mortal frame, escaping the hold of the plague god and vanishing in the tides of the warp storm. Farad roared in discontent, blasting the priest's remains apart with a shot from one of the many new weapons implanted within his frame, half living and rotten biomatter, half rusted steel and exposed cables. He was about to curse the dead man's foolishness when several of his cogitator blocks realigned themselves, and an entirely new train of thought imposed itself upon his diseased mind. He looked before him, and saw that the last of the humans were reaching out toward the ladders of the evacuation vessels. One of them, a man wearing the tattered remnants of what appeared to have been high-quality clothing at some point, glared in the direction of the Margus even as he kept climbing. Despite the distance separating them, Farad could see the hatred in the man's eyes, and it was a pleasing sight to him. Hatred was a force that motivated people to fight, to resist death, to endure anything the cruel galaxy could hurl in their direction. At the same time, hatred was very similar to rot, consuming the soul and sapping the moral strength of the one who harbored it within his soul. It was normal that Nurgle's agents be hated by those they sought to free from the constraints of their limited, blighted existence. It was a sign that they were doing their self-assigned task well. A name echoed through the gardener's fractured mind, carried over the timeless tides of the warp, Tarek. That was a significant name, one that had importance in Farad's existence, or was it that it would have importance in the future? It was always so difficult to keep tracks of such things. Beyond his own shattered mind, such things as past, present and future were all insignificant compared to the inexorable advance of decay that would inevitably one day usher the coming of Nurgle's true realm. The ships began to climb, dragging the ladders beneath them like birds of prey carrying their latest kill to the nest. Farad watched them, knowing that there was something he should do, a command he should issue through the links he shared with all of those who had been blessed by his work. Yet now, he hesitated. He could feel the will of the plague god spreading through him, and suddenly, with another jolt of energy as two cogitators were put in contact, he knew exactly what he had to do. Nothing. "You didn't give the order," remarked Petronicus to Farad. "Mercurian's minions spent several days warding these anti-air batteries so that we would be able to use them without them falling apart." The Plague Marine was referring to the heavy artillery that had been dragged from the empty fields where it had been deposited by transports, several dozens kilometers away from the hive, to prevent the crew from being infected. It had taken 2 weeks and hundreds of plague zombies, controlled by no less than 12 plague-born to ensure they didn't damage the things, to bring the weapons into position. It had been Arkan's plans to shoot down the evacuation crafts with them after they had rescued the last defenders, a deliberate insult to the Loyalist forces, which would have done far more damage to their morale than to their actual fighting capabilities. But Farad, who was supposed to send the order to the plague-born manning the weapons, had not done so, and the aircrafts were too far now. Farad's answer came in a buzzing voice, far from the emotionless vox speak that other tech priests affected. It was filled with zeal, warmth, and what Petronicus was fairly certain was admiration. "They have fought well. They resisted against the inevitable with all of their strength, knowing that there would be no escape from it but determined to keep on going. Is that not worth something? They will still fall against the unstoppable advance of decay. But today, I do believe that they have earned to live a little longer. Look at all the flesh they have broken, rendered down into brute components for Nurgle's science. The bottom of the tower supporting this dreadful place is surrounded by a veritable mound of corpses. Can't you feel the smile of the Plague Father as he looks upon what we have done here, with the help of these blind, unfortunate souls?" He could. Petronicus heard the booming laughter of the god of life and death in his head, just as he could feel his favor dripping from the tumultuous skies and into his rotting flesh, both in the form of the poisonous rain that had begun shortly after the Loyalists had escaped and in a more spiritual aspect. New diseases were forming inside his blood vessels, and he could feel the remaining skin on his body getting harder by the second. The corpses too damaged to be reanimated were dissolving into pools of putrefied liquid, from which countless demons of Nurgle were emerging, some the size of a virus, others as big as his head. Nurgle was watching, and the god of plague was rewarding him and the others for what had been done here in his name. But while Nurgle may be pleased with the ultimate result, Petronicus wasn't so certain that Arkan would be. The Lord of the Forsaken Sons had wanted to crush the Talaxorn defenders, deny them all salvation and send a message to the rest of the Loyalists' commander: "This is what will happen to you all. Behold your powerlessness." You cannot save any of them from me. Now, even though the Hive City had fallen, the survivors would be a tremendous boon to the morale of the other cities. The tale of their heroic resistance would inspire new heights of bravery. Definitely not what Archon had planned. They had lost several plague marines in the whole operation, and though Petronicus didn't feel any particular grief at their demise, death was all too familiar to the scions of the 14th Legion. He knew that the Awakened One held the lives of all Astartes in his service in high regard, and wouldn't appreciate the value of their deaths being diminished in the slightest. "You are in command of this operation, Farad," sighed the plague marine, expelling a blob of pus from his mouth as he did so. "Do as you please." He walked away from the Magus, approaching a group of zombies that were chewing on and tearing apart the bodies of a handful of defenders, their empty minds unable to realize that their preys were already dead. Once he was sure that Farad had moved on to other matters, he activated his armor's Vox link to the Hand of Ruin, thanking Nurgle that the equipment still worked despite his armor's state. He only had to wait a few seconds before the link was established. Evidently Archon had been waiting for him to call, having probably already seen everything from orbit. He chose to anticipate the inevitable questions. Farad chose to let them escape. "Lord Archon," he gargled over the Vox, feeling a new lump of putrescent liquid form in his throat. He felt that this would be a way of honoring Nurgle. And it worked, he quickly added, trying to lessen the damage. "I can feel the power of Nurgle flowing through me and this city." For a moment, there was no answer, and he felt a twinge of worry that this time, the Awakened One was going to be angry. And when Archon spoke, Petronicus was fairly certain that indeed, his liege lord was containing his wrath, focusing on the silver lining of the situation rather than allow his temper to get the better of him. It was difficult to be sure, since Archon wasn't exactly an expressive soul at the best of times, and Vox corruption didn't help, but he could feel the tension in the Awakened One's voice. "I see," replied the Master of the Forsaken Sons. "Well, he would know about such things even better than you, I suppose. And these few warriors hardly matter. Their death was more a test of the new artillery than anything else. If such eccentricities are the price of the Reborn's alliance with us, I guess it is a reasonable one." "You won't take action against him?" Petronicus was surprised. Archon was usually more demanding of those under his command. He had proved that he was merciless with those who disobeyed his orders, though the former Death Guard didn't know if it was because he wouldn't tolerate dissension, or because anyone foolish enough to disobey him was useless anyway. "I need him for the final stage of Parask's conquest. Besides, I think that this little stunt may actually serve our interests in the long term." Petronicus waited for a moment, before it was clear that Archon wasn't about to explain himself. Many things had changed since they had turned from the false emperor, but the need to keep one's plans secret even from your own side had not. With a final salutation, he closed the link, and walked out of the cathedral, to stand on the edge of the precipice that surrounded the building. Behind him, he could hear the Plagueborn directing the Unblessed into destroying all icons of the false emperor and replacing them with symbols of Nurgle. It would take a long time to transform the building into a worthy temple of the Plague God, especially since none of the Ascended Souls were working together, but their enthusiasm would lead them through in the end. He looked around him, watching what had become of Talexorn. The moving corpses were wandering aimlessly amidst the ruins, which already were being altered by the touch of the warp. With the last of the false emperor's faithful gone and the cursed church tainted, Nurgle was free to do as he pleased with the hive. The plague marine couldn't help but think of maggots emerging from a carcass. From the death of the city, something new would emerge, as was the way of the god of decay. He didn't know what it would be, but he knew that it would be glorious. Orpheus walked amongst the ruins, listening to the sounds of distant screaming. Here, in the fallen city of Nlemos, the melody of pain never truly ceased. It had kept going on since the beginning of the assault, 33 days before. With the decrease of living victims, the screams had started to be mostly echoes of past deeds, forever resonating in the cursed city as hordes of ghosts relived their final moments over and over. But there were still millions of survivors, cowering in fear or running for their lives. With food becoming scarce and countless monsters on the hunt, these pathetic riches were becoming more desperate by the day, seeking refuge in increasingly dubious locations. None, however, would come here, amidst the rubble of what had once been the headquarters of Nalimo's defenders. The place was the eye of the storm that had engulfed the hive, both its origin point and where its effects were the least pronounced. The pressure on the veil between worlds was strong, but it was kept quiet, as if not even chaos dared to disturb this hallowed place. He looked around, not with his eyes but with his sixth sense. His psychic hood was up, but such was the concentration of warp energy in the hive, and especially there, at Ground Zero, that he could feel the myriad echoes of emotion that imbibed every piece of rubble. He paid them no heed. He had come here for a very specific reason. After spending several weeks hunting across Nelimos, leading a pack of his brothers into slaughter after slaughter, a whim had taken him, to retrace the events of Nelimos' fall, to see with his own eyes how the mighty hive had fallen. More than that, he wished to test a new trick he had dreamed of last time he had allowed himself to rest, one that had doubtlessly been inspired to him by the youngest god himself. His chosen location of sleep had certainly aided. He had laid down amidst the corpses of 100 civilians, each of whom had spent the last hours of its existence screaming incoherently as Third Legion's torture blades cut their flesh. It felt like a pilgrimage, and in a way, it was. The city had been consecrated to sludge through pain and fear, and demons of the Dark Prince walked its streets alongside his mortal servants. Space Marines, cultists, and the resurrected Shailat, all had been unleashed at the Awakened One's command. They had been given only one order, to tear the Hive City apart, feasting on its people and giving a performance that even the youngest god would approve of. What Orpheus had in mind would be but one more act of desecration of deviant indulgence, but it would add to the strength of the colossal offering to sludge that Nelimos had become. Orpheus' psychic gaze finally found what it had been looking for. There, sitting on a pile of rubble, was a solitary helmet in the color of the Sons of Kalth. It bore the crest of a captain, and was the only recognizable remain in sight. The rest of those who had died here had been taken away as toys and trophies, or were deeply interred beneath the collapsed masonry. Why this particular relic had been left behind, Orpheus could only speculate. Perhaps the killers had recognized the importance of the warrior who had worn it, and sought to leave a memorial of their triumph over him. Perhaps it had been nothing more than a whim. Or perhaps the helm had simply fallen there in the tremors that shook the hive daily as its structure was compromised by the warping touch of the Empyrean. In the end, it mattered little. The relic was bound to the soul of the one who had worn it, now forever burning in the sea of souls, at the non-existent mercy of the Neverborn. It created a link to the echoes of the dead man's last moments. The sorcerer reached out with his hand, placing his palm atop the helm like a priest blessing a supplicant, and let the memories entrapped within the piece of armor flow into him. The captain had died when treachery had dealt a crippling blow to Nelimos' defenders. Galen stood at the extremity of the table where the Hive City's leaders had gathered. The room, once the domain of the administratum like the rest of the building, was guarded by several warriors of his 6th Company, and several hundred human soldiers were keeping constant watch over the neighboring streets. This level of security was the bare minimum for such a gathering, for all those present had been target of assassination attempts in the past few weeks. Military and civilian leaders were all present, all the differences they may have had long put aside by the warp storm and the threat of the Forsaken Suns. On the rare occasions when Galen's thoughts turned away from the endless task of protecting Nelimos, the captain considered how sad it was that it took such circumstances to force the human race to work together toward a common goal. 1 month had passed since the loss of Talek Sorn to the traitor's sorcery. During that period of time, the Sons of Kalth had doubled their efforts to root out the heretics still hiding in the territories ostensibly under loyalist control. Squads of Astartes and support platoons of Imperial soldiers were sent to purge hidden cults, while the priests of the Ecclesiarchy endlessly reminded the human population of the insidious threat of chaos, and of the necessity of praying to the God Emperor for protection. And during all that time, there had been no sign of the Forsaken Sons moving to attack. Galen knew that in the capital city, plans to counterattack and strike back at the traitors were made, examined, and abandoned daily. The chapter master and his advisors were as frustrated by the current situation as any warrior under their command, but there was simply no way for them to fight back efficiently. The Renegade's leadership was always aboard their ship, and the Sons of Kalth lacked any way to attack the Hand of Ruin with any realistic chance of success. Despite the fact that the vessel had far less firepower than most capital ships its size, it still boasted enough weaponry to outgun a small fleet, and would blast any carrier trying to approach it to pieces. The doors of the meeting room closed, and the captain turned his thoughts back to the matters at hand. It was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. for he had not slept in weeks, and his catalepsy and node could only do so much to keep him awake. Perhaps that was why he did not see the danger until it was too late. The man who had entered last, an administratum adept, acted the moment the door closed. He took something from within his robes and threw it on the table. Galen had a fraction of a second to see what it was, a sphere of black metal covered in runes shining with fell light, that began whirring the moment it hit the marble table. Then it exploded, projecting a wave of warp energy that engulfed all those present. Galen's sight went black, and the last thing he heard before succumbing to the darkness was the screams of these men and women with whom he had directed Nalimo's defenses for months, merging with those of otherworldly entities. The last thought that passed through his mind was one with which he was bitterly familiar. We are betrayed. Consciousness returned to the captain. He blinked, but still couldn't see. Something was obstructing his helmet's lenses. With hands that were entirely too weak for his liking, he reached for his collar and unlocked the helmet, letting it roll down and allowing himself to look at his surroundings with his own eyes. He appeared to be the only survivor. All others present in the room had been blasted to atoms by the force of the blast. Whether it was his armor that had protected him, or the strength of his mind that had sheltered him from the ravaging touch of the warp, the son of Calth did not know. When the Empyrean was concerned, both could be equally significant, or utterly useless, and there was no way of knowing which particular set of rules applied at any given moment. With a grunt, Galen forced himself to stand, and his senses returned, alongside with a new definition of torment. His whole body burned with pain, not the honest pain of wounds taken in battle, but a more insidious suffering. He could feel every molecule of his flesh rebelling against the unholy powers it was bathed in, resisting the mutagen touch of the warp. All around him, he could see the evidence of the Empyrean's influence. Blood was bubbling from cracks in the walls, bodies were decaying in seconds as soon as his gaze touched them, and the very air was filled with mirages in the shape of claws and fangs. All of it emanated from the center of the room, where the explosion had occurred. There was a wound in the fabric of space, a rift 3 meters high in the air. Beyond this gateway, Galen could see nothing, just pure blackness. On the ground before the rift was the remains of the traitor who had activated the fell device. He was dead, but it had not been a clean death. His body was wrecked by deadly mutations, reduced to a mass of bloated, cancerous flesh. The only part of it that was still intact, and which had allowed Galen to recognize the heretic, was his face. Its skin stretched out across the flesh in an expression of utter horror. For a moment, Galen wondered what had led the man to betray his kin for the false promises of chaos. The device he had used suggested that the Forsaken Sons had contacted him, that this wasn't some random act, inspired by the maddening whispers of the warp. Had the traitors offered him power, wealth, or just to spare his life, having already persuaded him that their victory was inevitable? In the end, it didn't matter. Galen had long grown used to betrayal. Like all sons of Calth, he had experienced it firsthand when the word-bearers had revealed their treachery on his now destroyed home world. He would not allow it to damage his resolve. The traitor had met his inevitable fate, and now it fell to Galen to make sure that this one act of treachery didn't. A movement from the rift interrupted his train of thought. Turning to face it, the captain saw a humanoid figure emerge from the blackness, walking slowly and calmly as though it hadn't just stepped inside a vision of hell. Galen had fought the Elders before, during the Great Crusade. He had traded blows with craft-world warriors and dueled against the cruel scions of the Dark City. This creature looked similar to them, but he knew with a glance that it was something else altogether. There was a darkness about it, an air of unending hunger that was similar to the sick lusts of the Kamara-born Eldar, but intensified to the point that it became visible even to those without a psychic sense. It was wearing a suit of what appeared to be leather, but a closest examination revealed that veins coursed across its surface, carrying black vitae. The thing was alive, and worn like a jacket by the Fey-like creature. From the back of the corrupt Eldar, 2 appendages emerged, as if bursting from the shoulder blades of the Xenos. They were tentacles, each ending with a fanged maw that snapped at the empty air and dripped drool onto the ground. Training and conditioning helped Galen ignore the pain of his flesh, and he hurled himself at the alien. Its apparition here and now could not be a coincidence. Somehow, the Xenos was related to the traitor who had detonated the warp bomb. He had lost his weapons in the explosion, but he didn't need them. Eldar bodies were frail, and this particular one did not look like one of their warriors. He would break its neck with his bare hands if he had to. Despite his wounds, Galen's enhanced muscles gave him the speed of a human's full sprint as he jumped. With his armor on, his kinetic energy should have splattered the Xenos even if he just crashed into it. However, before he could reach his target, the two tentacles lurched in his direction, each of them biting deep into one of his shoulders, before slamming him on the floor with enough strength to send cracks across the permacrete. Sparks ran across the Xeno's vestment as it somehow dispersed the kinetic energy of Galen's charge. Keeping the captain pinned in place, the creature spoke. "I am Ezirithn, firstborn of the Shai Ilat. You should be honored to be the first of your kind to learn my name. I promise you that many more will in the years to come." Galen grunted, and applied all of his strength to pushing away the repugnant tentacles that were locked around his shoulders. But the muscles had been severed by the thing's bite, and he couldn't muster the strength to break free, his efforts only causing the teeth to tear at his flesh. The alien saw his efforts, and smiled. "Do not struggle," it said with disgusting softness. "You will only cause yourself more pain. Just listen to me. You have already failed in your duty, little monkey. The glory of the Sea of Souls is spreading, cloaking this city from mortal sight and reach. It is at our mercy," the abomination continued, its voice still as soft as a breeze's touch on the skin. "Every soul within its walls will be sacrificed to she who thirsts, yours included. You will not be reinforced by your brothers. The children of the goddess will pick the flesh from this repugnant pit's bones, and every scream will make us stronger." Galen ignored the words of the creature, instead focusing his gaze beyond it, to the Chaos Marines that had emerged from the rift behind it. They wore the Baroque colors of the cursed Third Legion, though most of them had painted over the emblem of the Emperor's children on their shoulder pads with black paint and the image of a chained demonic visage. Each of them wore the mark of their sins on their bodies in an obscene homage to the dark power that owned them. Their armor was twisted, ceramite merging with skin that was covered in piercings crafted from the corpses of past victims. Their weapons looked like demented, oversized instruments linked to cannons, their circuits burning with warp fire and decorated with fell symbols. The captain had seen such weapons before, and knew how devastating their sonic blasts could be. These were instruments of ruin, created by the corruption of the warp as much as by cruel, debased ingenuity. Yet despite the disgust he felt at such a display of ruinous allegiance, Galen expressed his hatred on another thing. "Xenos," he whispered at one of them, making the word an accusation. "Filthy Xenos. Is there truly no limit to your corruption, traitors?" The Astartes didn't answer, and more Xenos emerged from the rift, wearing the same kind of living armor, symbiotically bound to their flesh. Dozens of them passed through, leaving the ruined room quickly, their alien eyes shining with unknowable hungers. Beyond the craft used to create their armors and weapons, there was no unity. Some carried blades, others maces, while a few carried no weapon Galen could recognize, and were accompanied by misshapen creatures of forged flesh and twisted bone. To his horror, Galen saw that several of the freakish beings had human faces on their bodies, distended and wrecked by unspeakable torment. "Corruption?" said Ezirithn mockingly, answering the captain's question in place of those he would have once called brothers. "Your every word reveals your ignorance. We are not corrupt, Captain." The creature said the last word with a sudden change in its tone, all softness gone, revealing the utter contempt it felt for the unfortunate warrior it was keeping immobile. "We are blessed," it continued. "Elevated above the rabble of the trillions of insignificant life forms that populate this galaxy. Raised beyond our previous existence by the hand of a divine being in order to do its will, much like you were." "We are nothing alike," replied Galen, forcing the words now, as he grew weaker. He was bleeding, the fangs in his limbs were generating some kind of poison his Astartes physiology couldn't counter, and his Lamaran cells were failing to close the wounds. "Are we? Your kind and mine were once just another few amongst a multitude of unremarkable existences. Then a being of unfathomable power took us from the lives we knew, and reforged us through extreme pain, making us both similar and different to what we once were, and granting us power we couldn't have dreamed of in the process. There is a similarity between us, warrior." The awakened one saw it. "That's one of the reasons he ordered we be brought back from the grave your former legion consigned us to." Galen's answer was to spit in the Xeno's face, sending acid toward the creature. It dodged it, and the spit fell back on Galen's own power armor, eating into the paint without causing it any real damage. The smile was gone from the creature's face now. Anger and bitterness were flashing across it now, along with a perverse delight it took in dominating Galen. It struck at Galen's throat with its bare hand, the sharpened nails tearing through his bared flesh. With a yanking motion, he tore the Betcher's gland out of the space marines inside, tossing the bloody organ aside. "I have been restored to this realm of existence by his will and the grace of the goddess," it pressed on. It lurched forward on Galen, their faces repugnantly close. "And this time, no misguided fool is going to kill me. I am going to hunt down and kill as many of your brothers as I can, and I will make sure all of them know who I am before they die." The two maws around Galen's shoulders tightened, and with a wrenching sound, his two arms were torn from their sockets, flesh and bone and ceramite alike, and tossed to opposite sides of the captain's maimed body. Ignoring the pain, Galen tried to rise to headbutt the alien in the face, seeking to at last take this wretched creature with him, but it kept him down with a single palm pressed against his chest, the force of his efforts dissolving uselessly into more sparks of energy. It took several minutes for the captain to bleed out from his stumps and the wound at his throat. All that time, he didn't stop trying to rise, nor did Azirath stop pushing him down. He died without uttering a single sound of pain, his eyes staring at the resurrected Xenos with unflinching hatred until the light inside of them went out. The sorcerer opened his eyes, leaving the memory of the son of Kalth's demise shuddering. To experience death in such a manner was an experience that could very well destroy a lesser being, but for the son of Fulgrim, it was a delight beyond compare, the ultimate transgression, going against the very order of life by knowing death yet remaining alive. His body was responding to what his brain had perceived, flooding his bloodstream with stimulants and forcing his two hearts to beat at the limit of their strength. Paradoxically, he felt more alive now than ever before. He had been part of the construction of the warp conduit. Its design had been inspired by the artifact that had trapped the essence of the demonic consciousness of the Forged World, back in the Mueller system. When the traitor had activated it, unknowing of its true nature, it had opened a gateway between the council room and the raging storm overhead, allowing the eldritch energies of the warp to pour onto the surface. Even now, Nlimos was surrounded by streams of warp fire, cutting it off from the rest of the planet, the unholy currents fed by the pain and emotions of those who lived and died inside its confines. This was beginning to be the standard tactic of the Forsaken Sons, Orpheus mused. One devastating blow to annihilate the enemy's command and throw his forces into disarray. Then the packs were unleashed to grind resistance to dust before it could coordinate and reorganize. The very nature of the forces in the Warband allowed for little else. Although the Astartes were united under Arkan's command, they lacked the discipline and true synchronization of Legion-born brothers. The Battle of Meridius had proven that the Forsaken Sons couldn't match the Sons of Kalth's tactical acumen. The Awakened One had seen that it was better to rely on specialized agents to deal the initial blow according to a precise plan, and then to simply let the forces under his command do as they pleased. In the case of Nalima's assault, this was made all the more important by the fact that the troops dedicated to the Hive's conquest were all servants of the youngest god. Hoping for any coordination between them would have been most foolish. After the city's leadership had been annihilated, Arkan hadn't even tried to control those chosen to take part in the assault. He had organized their arrival, tasking the Coven with opening several portals to bring the forces of Slanch into the Hive. After that, he had allowed them to do as they pleased, sheltered from imperial riposte by the warp energies that drowned the city in a sea of twisting nightmares. Orpheus smiled as he remembered how this method of waging war had also been the one favored by Horus himself, in the days before the Pantheon's endless whispering had driven him to megalomania beyond even that of the Emperor's children. The Battle of Istvan V had been the greatest example of this tactic, with a singular battle that could very well have won the traitors the war had not so many things gone wrong afterward. The sorcerer would never mention this similarity to Arkan, of course. The Awakened One's hatred for his failed father was a beacon in the warp, and Orpheus had almost been forced to avert his gaze when the former commander of the Sons of Horus had denounced the Primarch's faults on the desolated world where they had found Serexithar. He may enjoy savoring death by proxy, but he wasn't ready yet to feel it with his own flesh. There was much he intended to do, discover and destroy before that. And the first of the experiences he had yet to taste waited for him deeper in the Hive City. Before leaving, however, there was one last thing to do. Orpheus reached beyond the veil, seeking the fragment of Galen's soul that remained linked to this place. With a cruel pull of psychic power, he tore the shard of sentience from its repose, and attached it to his own soulfire. To all those gifted with the art, the ghostly image of the son of Calth's face was now visible around his shoulders, hovering above him like a crow above carrion. Enough remained of the loyalist space marine that he would be able to see all that Orpheus did from now on, but utterly unable to do anything to stop it. With the shade of Captain Galen bound to him, Orpheus began his descent toward the rest of the city. The hive was filled with the echoes of violent deaths, and he could feel one of these calling to his senses. He found the next corpse about an hour later, in the shadows of an alley, almost entirely buried beneath a collapsed wall. A single hand emerged from the rubble, stretching toward the blood-soaked skies as its owner tried to dig himself free. Without hesitation, Orpheus climbed the rubble, carefully shifting his weight so as not to bring it down, and seized the outstretched hand inside his own, the tiny hand completely disappearing inside his gauntlet. With the physical contact established, he sent a sliver of his mind toward the corpse, and immersed himself once more into the memories of the dead. The man had died alone in the dark, when his shattered flesh had finally given up after the torments inflicted upon it by the scions of the youngest god. The monsters walked amidst the ruins of the city, and their prey ran from them. All cohesion had been lost with the death of the city's leaders and the darkening of the skies, leaving more than 1 billion souls lost, at the cruel mercies of the Forsaken Suns. Before, the skies had been filled with the swirling energies of the warp storm. It had been dangerous then to even look up, for doing so was to invite madness into one's soul, but at least there had been light, baleful as it may have been. Now there was a cover of black clouds between the hive and the storm, and while being released from the dark illumination should have been a welcome deliverance, the situation was in fact even worse. The warp wasn't in the sky, now, it ran through the streets, twisting flesh and metal and stone while the servants of the Emperor ran in the dark, fleeing from those who had once been his children. Cal was one of the few survivors of his unit in the PDF. When the attack had begun, he had been sleeping in his barracks, his dreams haunted by images of death and ruin. He had woken up at the bottom of a pile of rubble, with what had felt like the weight of a titan pressing down on his chest. He had dug himself out over the course of several hours of bloody struggling and swearing, and things had gone downhill from there. From what he had been able to piece together, after the Chaos Scum had killed all of Nalima's leaders, some of them had bombarded the city from the highest spires, unleashing dread weaponry to raze whole districts to the ground. There didn't seem to have been any particular pattern to their targets. Cal suspected that the renegades had struck at random, indulging whatever whim had coursed through their diseased minds at the moment. He was even pretty certain that some of the districts targeted had contained traitor cultists before they had been flattened. Not that it mattered to the Forsaken Sons. Tens of thousands of Nalimo's own people had been driven insane by the horror unleashed on the city, and joined the invaders' ranks. In their madness, they covered themselves in gaudy, unholy symbols that did little to protect them from the demons roaming the streets and ran amok in feral mobs, killing all they crossed. As many of Cal's group had died to these poor bastards than to the depredations of the city's true enemies. At least they could fight back against the crazed humans, but when their path crossed that of a bunch of corrupt space marines, all they could do was run and hide, like they were doing now. Cal's heart beat in his ears like a drill sergeant's training drum as he ran. He and the rest of his group had scattered like a flock of birds when the Astartes had found their hiding place. Now, it was each man for himself, until the hunters grew bored and they could regroup. At least one of them wouldn't come back, but such was the price of living another day in this Emperor-forsaken hell of a city. They were prey, their weapons useless against the Chaos Marine's power armor or the demon's skin. They couldn't leave the city, the Forsaken Sons had complete control of the borders, and even if they had been able to leave, where would they have gone? The dark gods had reached down and claimed Nalimos. When warp lightning cast a light on the horizon, it showed only a great wall of blackness and smoke. They were cut off the rest of the world, trapped in this realm of madness with the servants of the youngest god, mortal or otherwise. A blast of sonic energy obliterated a pile of rockcrete to Cal's left, sending shrapnel all around. He felt several pieces of it hit his flesh, and though his sense of pain was dulled by the adrenaline coursing through his veins, he knew they would leave bad bruises if he lived long enough. He was already bleeding, from wounds taken during this flight and old ones torn open by the effort. In his fear-heightened state of perception, he could feel each drop of the blood leaving his body, and he figured he could sense the thirst of some great and dark beast for it. He kept running, turning this way and that, hoping against hope that he could shake off his pursuers. The sound of discordant laughter behind him reminded him of just how vain that hope was. Despite their cumbersome weapons, the Forsaken Sons could follow him with ease. Cal knew that this last shot could have easily reached him, and he remembered all too well what such a thing would do to a human body. He had seen several of his friends burst apart that way, their flesh reduced to sludge and splattered several meters away from where they had last stood. The Noise Marines. Cal remembered that Luke, the old man from the army, who had fought in the heresy before, had called them that, before they had gotten him too, were toying with him. They intended to take all the pleasure they could from the hunt before going in for the killing blow. The pursuit went on for several more minutes. Cal's limbs were burning with lactic acid, but his fear was granting him seemingly infinite reserves of fresh strength. He knew, in some part of his oxygen-deprived mind, that it was an illusion. He was on the verge of collapsing out of sheer exhaustion. His lungs were on fire, and black swathes were obscuring the edge of his vision, making it even harder to navigate the devastated streets. Had anyone else been chasing him, he would have fallen already, accepting whatever fate laid in store for him rather than continue this torture. But these were Chaos Marines, hailing from the ranks of the infamous Third Legion. Even someone like Cal had heard the horror stories about the fallen sons of Fulgrim. Even here, half a segmentum away from the throne world, astropaths and psychers had received visions of the Emperor's children's atrocious deeds on Terra. What Cal had heard of those days, and what he had seen since the Hive City had fallen, was like a white-hot iron brand in his mind, jolting him forward no matter how tired he may be. Something hit him in the back and threw him to the ground. He fell face first, and felt several teeth and his nose break at the impact. With trembling arms, the terrified soldier crawled forward and used a nearby wall to push himself up. Placing his back to the wall, Cal looked around for the source of the impact, his legs barely able to keep him standing. He found it quickly, and immediately wished he had not. A figure was crouching before him, taller than he was despite its posture. Cal instantly recognized it as one of the Chaos Marines, but this particular specimen was no foot soldier of the Legions, nor did he carry warp-spawned sonic weaponry. His power armor was painted in purple, with gold and silver ornamentation and the emblem of the Forsaken Sons on its shoulder. From whatever original design it had followed, it had been reshaped by mundane craft and the energies of the warp to reflect the true nature of its wearer. His helm had become a mockery of an avian predator, with an open beak containing several rows of sharpened iron teeth while two eye lenses of different colors glared down at California. The Astartes' legs ended in talons of metal and bone, probably useful to perch atop structures but clearly unsuited to walking the relatively flat ground of the street. The crouching position the warrior was thus forced to take allowed Cal to see the jump pack attached to his back. It was a burly and cumbersome thing, with two engines that looked nothing like the other devices of that kind Cal had seen before. Pulsing flesh and black veins were fused with darkened metal and cables crackling with warp energy, and he could see purple flames emerging from the engine's bottom. The same unnatural fire told Cal that the strange weapon in the raptor's hands was a flamer, and the soldier felt an incongruous surge of bleak hope at that realization. Being burned alive would be agonizingly painful, but at least it would be over quick. He closed his eyes when the Forsaken Son aimed the weapon, and waited for the warp fire to engulf him. Heat made the skin of his face hurt and his eyes water, but he didn't die. Surprised, he opened his eyes, and saw that the raptor had aimed the flamer above Cal and to the wall behind him. With a laugh that sounded like the screams of dying children, the Chaos Marine turned off his weapon, before activating his jump pack and vanishing from Cal's sight in a blaze of purple fire and foul smoke. Puzzled, Cal looked at where the flamer had hit the wall. Just in time to see the half-melted metal beams supporting the architecture gave way. The whole wall collapsed on Cal, burying him beneath stone and burning metal. Abject panic seized Cal's heart, and he desperately tried to move, to dig himself out of this grave. He couldn't breathe. He could barely move. Several of his bones had broken. He kicked and struggled and screamed, wasting his precious air in mindless terror. The vision ended, and Orpheus couldn't stop himself from taking a deep breath as his perceptions realigned with the senses of his own body. The sensation of suffocation and crushing death had been enjoyable, but what he had truly savored was the memory of the mortal's fear. As an Astartes, that emotion was unknown to him. He had heard that there were circumstances that would enable even a transhuman warrior such as himself to taste it, but he had never experienced them. He wondered if he would one day. With a pair of his power armor's servos, Orpheus ripped the hand of Gal's corpse off the arm it had been attached to. There was no blood, for the body had long emptied itself of vitae through its many deadly wounds. The sorcerer planted the gruesome trophy on one of his shoulder pad's spike. The sparks of psychic energy that always coursed on his warplate reached to the remnant, and Orpheus smiled as the piece of flesh twitched, dead nerves stimulated by the Empyrean's whims. As he moved toward the next sight pulling at his mind, Orpheus mused on the raptor he had seen in Cal's last vision in his life. He had recognized the warrior. His name was Cypherus, and he had been one of Orpheus' brothers even before the Exodus and Arkansas had made all of them brothers in spirit if not in blood. Like all of the Forsaken Sons, Cypherus had changed much since the beginning of the rebellion. First when the Legion had found illumination and embraced the path of excess, and then during the Exodus, when the streams of the warp had molded flesh and soul alike. The two of them had been part of the same company, and had fought together at the gates of the Imperial Palace. While most of the Third Legion had abandoned orders and attacked the human population of the Throne World, not all sons of Fulgrim had done so. Some had preferred the glory of the greatest battle of the war over the unrestricted carnage. It had been those warriors who had flocked to the Hand of Ruin when Archon had offered his help in leaving Terra. Orpheus felt no anger toward those of his brethren who had not joined the fight for the palace, although he knew many warriors from the other legions did. He understood the motives of his legion brothers, and did not believe things would have ended differently if the whole might of the Emperor's children had followed the War Master's orders. Many more things than the Third's utter devotion to the youngest god had stood in the path of Horus' victory. As Archon had pointed out all these months ago, all of the traitor Primarchs had made mistakes during the heresy. Still, the sorcerer was glad to have joined the fight and been picked up by the Sons of Horus worship when the siege had ended in shame and failure. As a member of a warband as disparate as the Forsaken Sons, Orpheus could experience things that would have been out of his reach had he followed the rest of his legion in their flight. The Neverborn spoke to him of what had become of his brothers, of the legion wars that raged across the Empire of the Eye. The scale of the battles they described was breathtaking, but Orpheus found wasteful to fight only other enemies of the Imperium. He and the rest of his brothers now scattered across Nelimos, were better off amongst the Forsaken Sons. This city was the perfect example of why Archon had delivered it to them on a silver platter, to do with as they wished. And not just the mortal followers of the Prince of Excess were welcome to the feast, demons had come in great number as well. They had emerged from the shadows of the hive and slaughtered at the side of the Emperor's children before vanishing back into the ether, most of them, anyway. He could feel one of them nearby, a potent specimen if his sixth sense was to be believed, but its exact location eluded him. It seemed as if the demon's presence was diluted, spread across a vast space and not focused inside a moving and hunting incarnation. Although he supposed it didn't really matter, he still had to be careful. Even if the Neverborn and himself were theoretically on the same side, the demons having been summoned with the help of the Forsaken Sons, he didn't doubt for a second this fact would prevent them from turning against him if the whim took them. Neverborn were creatures of instinct and immediate hunger, not reasoning and anticipation. That was one of the reasons why the Prince of Excess cherished his servants within the material plane. Their conserved intellect enabled them to pursue more varied pleasures than their immortal counterparts, just like their flesh gave them senses to which the Neverborn could never pretend without lurking within the body of a host. The pulse of soulfire he had been tracing emanated from a wall that surrounded the location of that consciousness. Figures emerged from the wall, like the sculptures of some demented artists. They were people, reaching out with petrified limbs, their faces frozen in a single moment in time. Orpheus could feel the embers of soulfire within them, the vestiges of the men and women they had been in life trapped within this demonic structure for all eternity. Many of them were damaged, but the level of detail on those intact was astonishing. Each and every one of the reaching statues had the same expression of powerless horror, all but one. A petrified Astartes stood calmly on the wall, petrified like all of the others. He wore a complete suit of armor, and the emblem of the Aquila visible on his chest plate revealed that the monochrome sculpture had once been a son of Calth. The body language of the position he had been fixed into radiated cold calm and self-control, despite the fact that the Space Marine had so obviously died and that his shade was now surrounded by the ghosts of those it had failed to save in life. Unlike all the other silhouettes, the Space Marines was also armed, his right fist holding a combat knife as it hung slack at his side. The statue was one of the rare entirely untouched, and Orpheus could guess why. There was a silent dignity to the figure, like a monument to a fallen hero. The Neverborn would hesitate in touching it, in fear that the echo it contained could somehow do they harm, while the mortal scions of Sludge were generally wise enough to avoid this region of the city. The sorcerer was curious to see what manner of death this proud warrior had endured that had yet allowed his ghost to remain so steadfast even in damnation. The son of Fulgrim placed his palm on the stone chestplate, and was instantly dragged from his body to a place of nightmares and shadows. The Space Marine had died along the last hope for Nalimo's survival. They came at him in an endless tide of fetid flesh and diseased minds. A horde of cultists, driven on by the false promises of their dark god, believing that slaying him would grant them the rewards they so craved. He stood alone against them, in the labyrinth that had replaced many of the Hive's districts. The touch of the warp had reshaped what had once been perfectly standardized heart blocks into a maze of non-Euclidean dimensions, trapping thousands of humans within its confines and slowly driving them mad. The son of Kalth suspected that the labyrinth was alive, the entire district being possessed by some malign intelligence of the warp that delected in the torment it inflicted on those trapped within it. The warrior had no name. He had once been a respected sergeant of his legion, a veteran of 100 campaigns, beloved by all who fought alongside him for his humor and quick wit. But that had been before Kalth. When the skies of that world had been poisoned by the word-bearers, forcing all combatants to take refuge in the caverns below the surface, the Astartes had been there. He had fought to defend one of the acrologies, housing 10,000 people, farmers and their families, from the horrors unleashed on the world by the traitors. Several years later, when the acrology had been rediscovered by Ultramarines reclamation teams, he had been the only survivor they had found. Since that day, he had not spoken a single word, taking avowed silence at the same time he had renounced his former identity, listed in the Legion's archives as one of the tens of thousands of warriors lost during the Kalth engagement. After the end of the heresy, when the Codex had been imposed upon all the loyal legions and new chapters had been created from their division, he had been chosen by Captain Galen to be part of his company amongst the sons of Kalth. Even among this chapter of survivors of Ultramar's most grievous loss, the nameless Astartes had been a solitary one. He had kept away from his brothers, fighting alongside them to cleanse the galaxy of Horus rebellion and remaining alone outside of battle. He knew his brothers thought him broken, and he knew they were probably right. What he had seen at Kalth had left a wound in his soul which would never heal, but it wouldn't prevent him from doing his duty to the Emperor either. Duty gave his life purpose, and a purpose was all a true warrior needed in his life. And now, his captain was dead, his battle brothers were gone, and the city they were sworn to defend had fallen into enemy hands. The people he was to protect had been driven mad and were trying to kill him, and, with no escape from the infernal labyrinth, he had no other choice but to kill them. He was down on his last clip of bolter ammunition, and his chainsword had run out of fuel several days ago. He could still fight, with his combat knife and his bare gauntleted fists if necessary, but he was being worn down. He felt the eyes of the demon that had created the maze upon him, and could taste the twisted pleasure it took in his situation and its frustration that, despite everything, he had not broken. The latter made him smile beneath his helm. No matter how grim his position may be, there was a chance of victory, however slim that chance and tiny that victory. And so he kept fighting. Hours passed as he broke bones and tore flesh, memories of charging and retreating blurring together into an endless fight for his life and soul. At some point, his bolter finally clicked dry, and he discarded the weapon in favor of beating his foes to death with his fists. Wounds were accumulating on his body, as did the damage to his power armor. More than any physical injury, though, it was fatigue that was slowly bleeding him of his strength. He had barely a minute of respite between two engagements, as if the labyrinth was guiding its deluded captives toward him, which, on reflection, it probably was. Space Marines could, thanks to their transhuman augmentations, stay awake for weeks on end and remain in fighting condition, but even they had limits, and time held little sense inside the warped confines of this maze. Already, the son of Kalth could feel that his brain was suffering from the lack of rest. His head hurt like someone was pounding it with a thunderhammer, and he thought he saw glimpses of slithering things at the edge of his vision. And then there were the voices, a choir of meaningless whispers, distant pleas for help and half-heard threats of death and endless suffering, all of which ceased the moment he tried to focus on them. He knew they were naught but the tricks of the warp trying to creep inside his mind, and he tuned them out with an effort of will, silently reciting the canticles of battle to himself. But he was so very tired. The son of Kalth jolted awake as pain like he had never known before reached his exhausted brain from all of his four limbs. Cursing himself mentally at the realization that he had blacked out, he took stock of his surroundings. He had been stripped of his armor, and was surrounded by a veritable ocean of emaciated, feverish madmen pulling at his arms and legs with all the force granted to them by insanity. There were so many of them that he felt his muscles and bones start to tear themselves apart, and no amount of trashing could free him from the press of bodies. The last son of Kalth and Limos died without a sound leaving his lips, his last living thought spent on twisting his own neck with enough strength to shatter a human's back with his reinforced skull. Being torn apart limb from limb was an entirely novel experience, and Orpheus savored every moment of it through the nameless space marine's eyes. So, this was how it had ended, how the last defender of Nelimos had died. After that, all that had remained was stragglers, fighting to survive, not to win. The fact that Orpheus had been unable to learn the name of the son of Kalth frustrated him, for he would have loved to tear his shade from the stone and bind it into servitude like he had Galen's. This may also explain why the statue had remained untouched. By being nameless, the Astarte's soul was granted a measure of protection against the denizens of the warp too weak to track down his path to before the events of Kalth. Still, despite his frustration, Orpheus had to admit that there was certain appropriate drama to the whole situation. The warrior's death was a symbol of his kind's failure to protect this city, his absence of identification making him a perfect representation of his chapter. Just like his defiance in death represented their ill-judged pride and belief that they could stand against the tides of chaos. As he gathered his power to grind the statue to dust, the sorcerer froze. Something was pulling at his awareness, demanding his attention, the siren call of another step on his pilgrimage, another dead body left to rot with a part in the tale of Nelimos' fall. But it couldn't be so. What more remained for him to see? With a half-hearted thought and a push of kinetic energy, Orpheus crushed the stone helm of the statue to dust. He took no pleasure in the desecration, his mind focused on the new spiritual tether he was perceiving. There was something different with this one, but he couldn't identify what. Besides, his goal with these visions was to relive the key moments of Nelimos' fall. After the death of the last son of Kalth within its walls, what could possibly remain of import to see? He walked toward the psychic beacon at a brisk pace, his impatience increasing with every step, to the point he considered using his powers to teleport directly to his destination, despite the ludicrous danger of doing so here. He held back from it, doing his best to savor instead the anticipation, relishing in the phantasms his mind conjured about what he would find when he finally reached his goal. The journey passed in the blink of an eye once he lost himself to his imagination, trusting his augmented reflexes to bring him safely to his goal. A normal human, moving at the same speed and without his full focus on his movements, would have slipped on the unstable piles of rubble and broken his neck a dozen times over, but Orpheus strode on effortlessly. And just like his physiology safeguarded him from mundane risks, the aura of power his soul was projecting in the ether marked him to the warp-touched madman and the never-born as a being of power, not to be trifled with. The sorcerer emerged from his trance when he felt the proximity of his target, pulling himself from a delicious daydream involving Slayer Ineshi Secondborn and the tears of maidens. He found himself inside a ruined manufactorium, filled with destroyed machinery and decaying corpses. There were more than 100 human bodies here, most of which wore the rags typical of Nelimos' surviving population. But more than a score were dressed in the baroque hues favored by the mortal servants of the Forsaken Sons in this city. A battle had taken place here, but none of the human remnants were the one calling to Orpheus' psyche. The object of his quest lied on the middle of the battleground, horribly mutilated by blade and bludgeon, to the point it took several seconds for the sorcerer to recognize it for what it was, using the color of the blood and the texture of the bones as clues. The corpse was that of Shai-Alat, one of the illuminated Eldar that Orpheus and Jacaerus had managed to return from the dead in an act of supremely delicious transgression of the universe's laws. The former Emperor's Children legionary was surprised to see that a band of lowly humans had managed to kill one of the resurrected Signs of Slanch. He knew it was possible for the Shai-Alat to die. Of course, the Ultramarines had brought their whole kind to extinction during the Great Crusade, after all. But to see the evidence of it with his own eyes was still surprising, and the spectacle of his work ruined stoked the fire of anger within his guts. Determined to learn what had happened here, and eager to see the world through the sublime senses of an Eldar, Orpheus placed his palm upon the remains, hoping the connection would be enough. Not enough remained of the Xenos for him to locate its skull, and the Shailat had died the death that always threatened all those who walked the dark paths. As he stared down into the mass of living beings massed into the slave pits, Loraka's smile was as horrifyingly ugly as it was eerie and beautiful. The Shailat's aspect reflected the dual nature of the goddess that had claimed his soul all these centuries ago. One moment, he and his wonderfully wrought suit of black biological armor appeared to be a sublime statue, the work of some otherworldly gifted artist seeking to give form to the very idea of physical perfection. The next, he was a hideous monster, his evil soul plastered across his elegant features, his inhuman hungers radiating from his every move. He could usually control which face he showed to the rest of the universe, but the wonders he was perceiving were wreaking havoc on his self-control. This Monkey city was drowning in the sea of souls, and every deed and thought of the faithful within its walls was pushing it deeper into the realms of the gods. The laws of physics were already breaking down, and the very fabric of reality could now be shaped by those possessed of a strong enough will. Loracus himself had little interest in performing such works, but he could appreciate its results. Impossibly huge and thin towers of shining crystal had been raised to contain the laboratories of the Gene Lords, and great pits had been dug where to store the vast bounty of flesh the city had provided. Millions of slaves had been herded into these holes for the amusement of the children of she who thirsts and to serve as material for the Gene Lords. Using the living bodies of these wretches as canvas, the reborn overlords of Paraxis were recreating the legions they had once commanded. Many were improving their old designs with the knowledge they had gained during their time in the Court of Excess. Some were working with their allies, the so-called Fleshmasters. Loracus doubted that these arrogant Monkey had anything to teach to the Gene Lords, who had spent centuries studying the myriad ways by which the living tissue of slaves may be turned to whatever use their better desired. But the niceties of the alliance had to be maintained. Besides, they had found a way to return the Shailat to life, so perhaps the Astartes weren't as stupid as the rest of their pathetic species. Although the alliance with the Forsaken Sons had been decreed by the Firstborn himself, whose statute marked him as the favorite of the goddess, Loracus couldn't shake off his disgust and contempt for the Monkey breed. He still remembered the Paraxis of old, when he had fought in the battles waged between Gene Lords as a champion of their flesh-forged hosts. Back then, the Monkey had been cattle, living only to serve the will of their better. But the galaxy had changed a lot since then, and he would have to do with what he was given. Even if it meant tolerating and cooperating with the Forsaken Sons' most obnoxious servants. "Are you done watching the spectacle yet?" came the voice of precisely such an individual, interrupting Loracus' enjoyment of the misery being inflicted on those in the pit. "Yes," he answered in a long-suffering tone, turning away from the unprotected edge of the pit. The promontory directly oversaw the keeping area, where slaves were lowered on great, overcrowded platforms with as little safety as the pit's borders. Several Monkey had fallen down while looking at the slaves, the lucky ones dying as they crashed amidst the thousands of those they had betrayed. But Loracus had a Shailat sense of balance, and he knew he would never fall. "A new group of survivors has been found," began the creature which called itself Mikhail. "My scouts tell me that there are almost 100 of them this time." "Then they must be a resourceful group," noted the Shailat warrior. Most of the groups of Monkey they had hunted in the last weeks numbered no more than a dozen. In the first days of the invasion, they had herded panicked mobs of hundreds of thousands, leading them straight into open spaces that collapsed into a pit when the Gene Lord for whom they were working found that he had enough subjects gathered. But after that, only the craftiest and luckiest had escaped the thousands of Slayer-Ineshi devotees hunting through the ruins. In a stark lesson on the Monkey's nature, these individuals operated in small groups, scavenging what they needed from the ruins. Basic necessities, however, weren't the true reason for the group's small numbers. Indeed, the attack of the Forsaken Sons had hit the hive like a great disaster, killing millions in the first hour alone as the warp's touch spread cataclysm and destruction. Far more people had died to the natural effects of the attack than at the hand of the invaders, and despite their number the children of She Who Thirsts could scarcely control a tenth of the immense, bloated hive city. That left plenty of resources laying in the ruins in various states of decay for the survivors to claim. Trust, however, was in shorter supply than food and water. With glorious madness spreading like an infection, The survivors kept to themselves, wary of any other scavengers they may cross on their excursions away from their hideouts. They stayed with their families and closest friends, forming packs of prey easily dispatched or captured by the hunting parties of the Chaos Invaders. A group of 100 survivors was unheard of at this stage of Nalimo's collapse, well, unless you counted the millions massed in the slave pits and fed chemical-rich liquid and the recycled carcasses of the Gene Lord's failed experiments. "Lead on, then," Lorakas commanded, feigning not to see the flare of fury on Mikhail's face at being so addressed. The half-breed's brooding anger at his position beneath the Shailat was sometimes amusing, but it paled now before the prospect of a new hunt. The two of them walked to where the rest of their hunting party was stationed. About 50 cultists were laying around in the abandoned warehouse, indulging in whatever debauchery had captured their dull and bland imaginations. Lorakas was the only Shailat in this group, the dubious honor of being paired with the Monkey cultists' leader falling to him simply because he had been the one to first contact the mortal. The rest of the Shailat who weren't Gene Lords were similarly dispersed among the other hunting groups, though a lucky few had been accepted by groups of Forsaken Sons, and hunted alongside the transhuman warriors. At Mikhail's command, the cultists began to rise and gathered their equipment. For all that he despised the half-breed, Lorakas had to admire his hold on his wretched little army. They were ready in less than 5 minutes, and left the relative stability of the Gene Lord's district for the ruins. On the way, they passed several Forsaken Sons patrolling, keeping a disinterested watch in the unlikely case of an attack. Once in the wild area, the hunting party began to move carefully, avoiding the hordes of madmen and careful not to give away its presence. Mikhail's scouts had not found any sentinel near the survivors' hiding place, which was surprising but not unheard of. Several hunting parties had used poorly concealed sentinels as a way to locate fresh prey. But they could still be noticed by wanderers returning to their base after a scavenging trip, and since most of the cultists wore clothing that made Lorakas laugh as much as want to cut their throats, they had to rely on advanced scouts to ensure the way forward was clear. These scouts were the product of the Fleshmaster's experiments, having endured lesser versions of the chirurgies by which the Astartes of the particular bloodline that had dedicated itself to She Who Thirsts. Implanted organs and rewired brains had gifted them with a supernatural sense of hearing that also made them unable to feel anything other than auditive stimulation, a great way to ensure they would wear their camouflage gear and not the ludicrous tunics favored by the rest of the Monkey rabble, Lorakas had to admit. One of them came back to report to Mikhail, and the Shailat warrior took a moment to admire the work of the Hall of Akulpio's lords. The Monkey, Lorakas was honestly unable to tell its gender, had 2 holes where its ears should have been, its skull forcefully broken open to allow for the crude biomechanical implants that granted it its enhanced perceptions. Stitches from the brutal operation spread all across its hairless head, keeping its skin in place and the dislocated parts of its skull together. "He wants to talk to you, Lorakas," called Mikhail, and the warrior moved to the scout's side, unceremoniously shoving the cultist's leader away. The scout remained silent, watching Lorakas with wide eyes. Deciding that terrified respect could wait until after the hunt was over, Lorakas was about to order the mortal to get on with it, when suddenly, something hit him from behind, and he felt a warm sensation inside his armor. He turned to see what had happened, and saw Mikhail, holding up a blade that dripped with black blood. "What do you think you are?" The next strike took Lorakas in the throat. The blade cut through his armor like it wasn't here, and tore into his flesh. Immediately, blood that should have irrigated his brain began to pour out of his body or down his respiratory system, and the Shailat began to cough weakly as his lungs filled with his own blood. He fell, and immediately the scout caught one of his arms and pressed it down the ground, followed by more cultists, who were laughing maniacally at their manhandling of their former superior. The pain was too great. He should be able to endure such a wound, even before his rebirth had granted him some of the regenerative capabilities of the Neverborn. The throat injury, perhaps not, but the wound on his back should have healed by now. He had tested his healing capabilities soon after his resurrection, watching in fascination as the cuts he inflicted to himself vanished in the time it took him to breath. But this one refused to close, and the sense of numbness spread across his body, robbing him even of the pleasure of such an agony. "See that blade, Lorakas? I wonder, do you recognize it? Oh, I forgot, it is difficult to speak when drowning in your own blood." Mikhail was holding a serrated knife, its metal shining with the reflected light of the burning machines in impossible spirals of illumination. Even with his consciousness slowly fading, Lurakas knew it to be an artifact of power, carrying the touch of the gods into the materium since long before Arkan had plunged the stars into the warp. This was the reason his wounds weren't healing. The blessings on that weapon were countering his own. For the first time since his return from the court of excess, Shailat knew fear as the realization that he was going to die hit him, and half-forgotten memories of what waited on the other side began to resurface. It was so easy to drag you away. Always eager to prove your superiority over us humans, weren't you? But you are not going to be the star this time. You are going to die here, Lurakas. I am going to cut you apart, and we are going to feast on your corpse. Can you imagine what rewards the Dark Prince will bestow upon us for such an offer? The blood of one of his own children. Is there any greater delicacy in this galaxy? The half-breed lowered his face until he was almost kissing Lurakas, and kept speaking, his voice barely more than a whisper. And then, after you are dead, we are going to kill all the fools hiding in that manufactorium, and leave your desecrated remains amidst the carnage. Even if the Forsaken Sons or your kindred find them, they will just think you got killed by lowly Monkey. It would surprise me greatly if they wasted the effort of bringing you back after such an ignominious death. The pinned-down alien tried to speak, to spit down his defiance and swear that he would return from the grave and inflict upon Mikhail and his followers tortures they couldn't imagine, but all that left his lips was a weak gurgle. Darkness closed in around Lurakas as he kept struggling against the Monkey, pressing his limbs to the ground, his pale blood flowing from his wound like a torrent. Mikhail was leering above him, his face torn open by a too large smile that revealed the additional teeth at the end of his jaw. Ecstasy was written plain on the hybrid's features as he held the knife before Lurakas' eyes, and the last emotion the Shailat felt before slipping away, back into the goddess' acidic embrace, was rage at seeing such a sacred relic in the hands of such a lowly creature. Orpheus let go of the Shailat corpse in nothing less than shock. Not shock at the relived sensation of death, but at the simple idea that a mortal, even one elevated like Mikhail had been, with the blood of Fulgrim himself flowing, albeit diluted, through his veins, could plot the death of a Shailat and succeed. Part of him screamed to warn Arkan, to tell him of this potential threat to their alliance with the reborn illuminated Eldar. If word of that murder reached Tezzerath the Firstborn, well, all bets were off on how the creature would react. Perhaps he would turn on Arkan, or perhaps he would simply plot revenge against Mikhail alone. Perhaps he wouldn't even care, and laugh at the folly of his kindred, to be killed in such a manner. Nevertheless, Orpheus had to warn Arkan. But he was too busy reveling in this sensation. How long had it been since he had actually been shocked by anything? Was it during the La campaign? When he had had his nerves rearranged into new patterns by the Legion's apothecaries? When he had learned of the coming rebellion, and of the side the Phoenician had chosen for the Emperor's children? When he had fought on the grounds of Istvan III, murdering those who had once been his brothers because it was his lord's command? He couldn't remember. All of his memories blurred together in a sea of excesses. But he knew that it had been a very long time since he had last been able to experience shock. The path of the profligate one required its followers to discard all notions of morality, and embrace the myriad sensations their bodies could grant them. This made genuine shock, the simple surprise of beholding something that wasn't previously part of your conception of the universe, a rare and treasured thing. To fight against one's fellow servant of the Dark Prince, that was the source of his shock. During the heresy, he had never fought against another of the Emperor's children. Duels to the death were hardly uncommon in the Legion, but as a sorcerer, his path had kept away from such circles. That was why the image of Mikhail killing Lurakas had such an impact on him. What would he feel if things went downhill? If the Shailat and the Forsaken Sons turned on each other in one more glorious battle of the Great Game? The sorcerer laughed, and began the walk back to the Forsaken Sons' camp. This matter required more reflection. He would think about it while excruciating a few humans, and then make a decision whether or not to warn the Awakened One.